I call the clerk.
Government business. Next order of the day. Resumption of consideration in detail on the Electoral Legislation Amendment Electoral Reform Bill 2024.
The Federation Chamber is considering the bill as a whole, and the question is that the bill be agreed to. I call the member for Indi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I move Amendment 1 as circulated in my name. This amendment would pause the commencement of the administrative funding provisions until the government has undertaken an independent audit of the administrative expenditure incurred by registered political parties. This is modelled on what happened in South Australia, which has undertaken an independent audit with Deloitte to audit major party accounts to determine whether the level of administrative funding provided under the bill is actually justified. The Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters recommended administrative funding due to the increased donation disclosure requirements under the bill. And I want to be clear, I unequivocally support the lowered donation disclosure threshold and the real-time disclosure provisions in the bill. I can't emphasise this enough. This is really important, and I'm very pleased that the government have gone to the level of detail around this. This is very important. But, and here's the but, JSCEM did not recommend how much this administrative funding should be. According to the Australia Institute, 85% of the new administrative funding will go to the major parties. If a challenger from outside the major party duopoly wants to run for election for the first time, they will not benefit from any of this money, compared to a new entrant or incumbent from a major political party who likely will. Now, I question whether the major parties will need $30,000 per member in the House of Representatives to undertake these new administrative burdens, especially when new entrants or challengers are getting zero, nothing, zip, to help them comply with this disclosure threshold. No financial assistance at all for the new donation disclosure requirements that they are equally subject to under the law. And I question whether this creates a level and fair playing field. As an incumbent, I will benefit from this funding, but as an independent, I don't just want to pull up the ladder from behind me. I want to see new independents and challengers fairly enter the competition, because we have seen that they only improve the competition. Madam Deputy Speaker, these amendments are here in good faith. We should have solid evidence that underpins the numbers that we're given in this legislation. I mean, as far as we know, as far as the taxpayer knows, these numbers could be just plucked from thin air. And what we do know is that this amount of money is going to advantage the major parties to an extraordinary level. These amendments would make sure that the government does the work to justify, not only to us as a parliament, but to the Australian taxpayer, how they've come up with the numbers that they have.
The question is that the member be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Those against?
No, but sorry, no.
I think the noes have it.
The ayes have it.
Is a division required?
Yes.
Excellent. Therefore, the question is unresolved and will be made a matter for the other chamber. I call the member for Indi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I ask leave of the Federation Chamber to move amendments 5 to 7 as circulated in my name together.
Is leave granted?
Leave is granted.
I move amendments 5 to 7 as circulated in my name. It's not clear to me, as yet, until the Minister makes his response, if the government wants to justify the amount of administrative funding they've set up under this bill. I really hope they will. But in case they don't, I need to have this amendment. And this amendment applies a reasonable cap to the administrative funding received by the major parties. The amendments apply a cap after an equivalent of 32 members of Parliament across the House of Representatives and the Senate receive administrative funding set at a rate of $3,750 per quarter. Now, you might ask how I arrived at these numbers. Well, I did the homework. Again, this amendment is based on South Australia, which set a cap of administrative funding to 10 MPs. It would take into account economies of scale of parties, which is not recognised under the current bill. It would ensure there is not a disproportionate amount of administrative assistance funding going to the major parties. Madam Deputy Speaker, I urge members to support these amendments. Spending $30,000 per member of the House of Representatives and $15,000 per senator is an enormous amount of taxpayer money. It's not justified. It can't be set out in any evidence that would give us comfort. We need to curtail this. So I put these amendments to the House, and I thoroughly recommend any thinking member in the House of Representatives to back in these very, very sensible amendments.
The question is that amendments be agreed to. I call the Assistant Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'll just start by thanking the member for Indi for her engagement on this bill. I want to address a few of the issues that are raised across the collective of the amendments that have been circulated, that one which we have a deferred division on, and the ones that the member has just spoken to. This will probably be my major substantive contribution in this stage of the consideration in detail for the member for Indi's contributions, but I may, if I can, come back a little bit later in the discussions just to address some other matters that were raised in the House prior to question time. If I can just say, when it comes to administrative expenditure, actually one of the things we're doing is providing more, in this bill, more scrutiny of money that's provided to political parties than currently applies for public funding that already exists for political parties. As we see in page 144 of the explanatory memorandum, it very clearly states that in terms of the use of this money, whether it be provided to an independent member, independent senator, or a member who's a member of a political party, quote, "This funding cannot be used on campaign advertising in any election, whether federal or state. Administrative assistance funding that is not spent in the calendar year it is received must be returned to the Commonwealth the following year." A good assurance measure. Further, it outlines on that same page the framework through which we have compliance and auditing controls. It says that this framework will be subject to compliance and auditing controls, including the AEC's strengthened investigative powers provided by Schedule 9 of the bill. If a recipient provides the AEC with incorrect or incomplete information about the recipient's administrative expenditure in its annual return and subsequently refuses to provide further information on request, the Australian Electoral Commission will have powers to reduce future payments of administrative assistance funding or recover amounts paid. Further, I want to say that this does, as the member just noted, give effect to recommendation 8 of the JSCM interim report to introduce a new system of administrative funding, and the model that we've introduced is consistent with the existing frameworks that people are familiar with, the works in Victoria, New South Wales, South Australia, the Australian Capital Territory. I just want to address the question of the suggestion in the circulated amendments around an independent review. Obviously, we do have, as a long-standing practice of this place, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters doing a review after every election. Different ministers of state have added additional questions to those inquiries, and indeed that is, some of those questions are the reason that we now find ourselves here. The government appreciates the suggestion of what else can be done to look at the review of this, and I want to thank the member for Indi for her constructive engagement on that question, and note that conversations are still ongoing around what that may look like. If I can go to the amendments when they come to the targeting of funding in a particular division, I think it's just worth noting that where you have a party that is contesting every seat, as is common across a range of parties represented in the parliament, that effectively introduces a cap that they can spend in that particular seat of $600,000, whereas an independent member who's contesting can spend $800,000. The other thing I just note is that it is the government's view that there has been extensive consultation on this. Now, no one in this parliament is part of every single conversation of that consultation, but I have in previous answers outlined in detail not just the consultation that's happened when we've had conversations through the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters and the report, and that having been out there for a year, but also extensive consultation that's been led by the Special Minister of State with a range of people who are here in the Federation Chamber right now, parties or other bodies that may interact in detail with them, third parties. There's obviously been a lot of representations for the charitable sector to make sure that they're not unnecessarily impeded in their work. We've had consultations with smaller community organisations who might have incidental activity, and it's one of the reasons we've lifted that reporting cap for those third-party entities to $20,000. But I'll just conclude where I began, Deputy Speaker, which is to thank the member for Indi for her suggestions. While the government won't be supporting this amendment, we are continuing to have conversations around how do we make sure that we can get both this legislation done, but also make sure that, as we have done through the normal Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters or other processes, continue to refine and review initiatives of this Parliament, particularly when it comes to electoral reform.
Thank the Minister. The question is that the amendments be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against?
No. Noes have it.
Is a division required? Then the matter will be referred to the other chamber. I thank you. I call the member for Indi.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I move amendments 3 to 4 as circulated in my name.
Is leave granted? Sorry, the question. Sorry. Yes, is leave granted? Minister.
Well, I can do it.
Leave is granted.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. These amendments ensure electoral expenditure targeted at a division counts against the division cap, regardless of whether it mentions the candidate. This goes to the heart of the concern of the crossbench, Deputy Speaker. You've heard us speak about this time and time again in this rather short debate. In fact, it's only the crossbench who have been speaking in this debate, if we're perfectly honest. This is the bit that matters. This is the bit that seems to be dismissed. Well, not seems to be, is being dismissed by the major parties, and there's a very good reason for that. Because under the current expenditure caps in the bill, major political parties could spend up to $800,000 in the 30 or so marginal seats they're focusing on to form government. Now, the Assistant Minister is quick to say that the major parties would be contesting every seat across the nation. But let's be absolutely honest. We know that major parties target some seats more than others. So $800,000 in the 30 or so marginal seats they're focusing on to form government, and then they spend significantly less in other seats and still not reach their $90 million expenditure cap. But under the bill, registered political parties won't exceed the $800,000 cap if they don't target that division. That means if advertising or other electoral spending doesn't mention the candidates or the electorate name or refer to their likeness, it doesn't count towards the $800,000 for that seat. This goes to the heart of our concern. We've all gone through elections where the entire electorate is just blanketed in major party paraphernalia. Vote Labor, vote Liberal, vote National, whatever it might be, and this would be allowed. This means you could be in the main street of Wodonga in Indi looking at a billboard for an independent, maybe it would be me with my smiling face, that counts towards the $800,000 spending cap. All within the rules, that's good. On the other side of the road, however, the billboard that says vote Liberal wouldn't count toward the cap at all. Isn't that cute? This is deeply concerning. These caps still mean the races in particular seats can be completely distorted by who can spend more than the other person. And it will be the major parties who can spend more because this legislation makes sure of it. This amendment would curtail this egregious problem in this bill. It would mean that regardless of what electoral expenditure major parties spend in a seat, and let me be clear because I was misrepresented last night by the Assistant Minister, I agree with expenditure caps. Make no mistake, I do. But this amendment would curtail this massive loophole that you could drive a B-triple truck through. It would mean that regardless of what electoral expenditure major parties spend in a seat, whether it mentions the candidate or not, they cannot exceed the level playing field, the supposed level playing field of $800,000. This is the cap that independents are subject to. This is the cap that the major parties must be subject to if this is to be a fair and reasonable electoral reform. This amendment would help level the playing field, and it would help ensure that independents, whether they're incumbents or whether they're challengers, are not drowned out by the major parties. And I, again, ask all members of Parliament, read the legislation, see what you're signing up to, And I would say to you, you should support these amendments if you truly believe in electoral reform.
To assist the chamber, could I ask the member for Indi to formally move her amendments?
Madam Deputy Speaker, yes, I formally move my amendments as circulated in my name.
The question is that amendments be agreed to. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise in support of the amendments just moved by the honourable member for Indi, because actually, when it is all said and done, I think she has really hit the mark when it comes to the heart of what is the key issue here. People like myself have copped a lot of criticism in this parliament because of the amount that was spent to see the seat of North Sydney turn independent. Now, in part, that's because there is no doubt about how much money was spent in North Sydney. The seat is fully accounted for in terms of what was invested. We do not, even under the current system, have the same line of sight when it comes to the major parties. We do not know what the major parties spent in McNamara to win McNamara. We do not know what the major parties spent in Bradfield to win Bradfield. All we know is the combined campaign spending. And I actually find it pretty extraordinary that when you go to look at the returns during the 2022 election year, there are members currently sitting in seats in this House that have a 0 next to their name in terms of how much money was spent in their electorate during the 2022 election. How does that work? How does that work? And so I think what we've seen in what the member for Indi has brought forward here is a complete acknowledgement. Very happy to see expenditure caps introduced, as long as the expenditure caps are the same for everyone, and that the transparency around that expenditure is the same for everyone. So I really thank the member for Indi for continuing this fight. I think she's very clearly articulated the upside of looking at this piece of legislation through what she's proposing, and I really would welcome the government seriously considering this amendment as a true show of faith that they are looking to create an equal playing field, not just embed a political duopoly.
Question is the amendments be agreed to. I call the member for McKellar.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I also would like to speak and stand in support of the member for Indi's amendment. I agree, it absolutely goes to the heart of probably what is the major problem with this piece of legislation, and that is how unfair it is, the structure is in that, sorry, here we go. So agreeing with the member for Indi, and it goes to the crux of what the major problem is. And the major problem is how it bakes in how unfair the spending can be, the spending caps. So we've talked about this before when we were debating in the House. Currently, as it stands, an independent or a new entrant can spend $800,000, that is their cap. A member of a party can spend $800,000, but an additional, who knows how much, in the millions can also be spent on top of that, as long as that candidate's name is not mentioned specifically. So it does mean that there's a very unfair advantage for that person who is the member of a party. How is it that this is fair competition? It is absolutely not fair competition. We know that our democracy, it should be a contest of ideas, but this is baking in an unfair advantage. But the member for Indi's amendment really goes to the heart of sorting out that major problem. Thank you.
The question is that the amendments be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Those against say no. Is a division required? Right, I refer this matter to the other chamber for a division. The question is the amendments be agreed to. I call the member for Indi.
Speaker, I move Amendment 2 as circulated in my name.
Leave is granted.
I move Amendment 2 as circulated in my name. Madam Deputy Speaker, this amendment ensures that this bill goes to an independent statutory review before the end of 12 months after the first election that is held after July 2026. Currently, under the bill, the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters is required to undertake such a review. But, Deputy Speaker, let's be honest. This is like the fox guarding the hen house. The JSCAM committee comprises of parliamentarians. Parliamentarians actually doing a review on their own expenditure and their own disclosure is problematic when it comes to electoral reform. We need to make sure that the Australian public and indeed the Parliament can have complete confidence in what is, as spooked by the government, the biggest reform in electoral matters in 40 years. We need an independent review that would ensure that the amendments to the Electoral Act are scrutinised by an independent panel, not members of Parliament who quite clearly have a direct interest in the bill. The independent review would directly consider the effectiveness of the bill in achieving transparency, accountability, integrity and public confidence in the electoral process and its participants, including the impact of expenditure and gift caps. This amendment, I've got to say, is a really good amendment. This amendment would ensure we actually know what the impact of these reforms are. Some of the biggest reforms, as I've said, in our democratic process. This amendment, too, like other proposals I've put to this chamber, is modelled on what's currently in the South Australian bill. And might I say that the good features of the South Australian bill are a direct result of the scrutiny that that bill was given. It's amazing what happens if you put a detailed piece of legislation to parliamentary scrutiny through the committee process. You actually get improvements and good ideas. So there is a similar independent review provision in the Victorian legislation. Deputy Speaker, this is sensible, it's reasonable, it's ethical, it dismisses all conflicts of interest and, that's a big deal. I urge the governments to consider these amendments. This can only bolster your case. This makes you look good. This gives the public confidence that what you're proposing is not what the crossbench says. I mean, we've been really clear with you that we think there's elements of this bill that for the unsuspecting eye could be perceived as one mighty big stitch-up. Prove us wrong. Have an independent statutory review 12 months after the election when these laws come in, and let's see how it stacks up. I've been very pleased to work with the Minister's office on all of these amendments. I do so in good faith. As I've said before throughout this debate, I thoroughly endorse improved transparency and disclosure laws. 100%, been screaming for it from the moment I got here. I thoroughly endorse donations caps and expenditure caps, subject to the amendments that I've put forward in regards to that. And I absolutely and utterly believe that a statutory review, rather than a JSCAM review 12 months after the election when these laws come in, can only be for the good of the nation and can only lock in the improvements that invariably we might need to have. So let's do that. Let's make that amendment. I urge the government to support that amendment. And again, and I say to members who may be listening maybe from their offices, given that they're not participating in the debate, that you should really be in here supporting an amendment such as this. So I thank you, Deputy Speaker. I thank the Minister. I hope he might respond to that, and or perhaps some of my parliamentary colleagues might. And I commend these amendments to the House.
The question is that the member be agreed to. I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I rise again in support of the amendment moved by the member for Indi. And I've just got to say, how sensible is the member for Indi and her team in terms of how they approach not only this piece of legislation, but every piece of legislation that we see come into the House. I think there are very few members in this House that have a higher level of integrity than the member for Indi. So when you hear the member for Indi suggest that the best way for a piece of legislation to be scrutinised is by an independent parliamentary committee, you can actually pretty much guarantee that she knows what she's talking about. This is a member that has been involved in developing bodies like the National Anti-Corruption Commission. This is a member who has argued since she joined Parliament for increased levels of integrity in this place. But for those who are at home wondering why you wouldn't just go to a standing committee, a joint standing committee on electoral review, I just want to explain to people the structure of parliamentary joint committees in this place. So what usually happens in a parliamentary joint committee is that the party who is of government of the day dominates the committee. They have the most numbers on the committee. And in fact, in every committee in this place, bar one, and that is actually the National Anti-Corruption Committee, Parliamentary Joint Committee, the committee will be chaired by a member of the government of the day, and the deputy chair will be from the opposition of the day. Now, in the case of the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Reform, which is a great committee, I think we should have it, we should be very transparent around it, the truth of the matter is it was originally tasked with looking at the results of the 2022 election, an election which created the largest crossbench in the history of Australian Parliament. It has the largest number of independents sitting in it in the history of Australian Parliament. Yet, interestingly, playing along at home, there wasn't an independent on that committee.
Yes, there was.
No, not until Kate joined, the member for Curtin, joined the committee on the last hearing day. So for all of the hearings prior to that, there was not a person of an independent political persuasion involved in the assessment. And in fact, when the report was tabled by what we call JSCEM, the member for Curtin, the only independent member of that committee, lodged a dissenting report. And she provided commentary around where she felt things were heading in the right direction and where things can be improved. Now, in an environment where we do the best we can in this place, and I believe everybody comes to the questions we have in absolute good faith, the truth of the matter is when we are looking at something as important as this, we should be able to delegate to an independent statutory review. And that's where the member for Indi has nailed this recommended amendment to the government. At the end of the day, this legislation has not had a lot of light during this debating process. If we could go back to our communities and say, if nothing more, at least we know in 12 months it will be independently reviewed, then I think the Australian public could take some faith that there will be somebody other than the major parties looking at how this is functioning. Thank you.
The question is that member be agreed to. All those in favour say aye. Those against?
No.
I think the no is a division required.
Division's required.
And this should be referred to the other chamber. The question is that the member be agreed to. I call the member for Clark.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I move the amendment circulated in my name. Deputy Speaker, in essence, this amendment, it's very brief, and all it does is seek to modify the title of the bill from simply referring to electoral reform to referring to, and I quote, the funneling of public money to the major parties under the guise of transparency. Now, this isn't meant to be funny, Deputy Speaker, at all. It's a deadly serious amendment, and I think an appropriate bookend to the case the crossbench has made against these reforms over a number of days now. I have become disillusioned with the practice in this place of naming bills in misleading ways. And this is an opportunity to name this bill correctly, because this bill does exactly that. This bill seeks to funnel public money to the major parties under the guise of transparency. I make the point again, Deputy Speaker, that my crossbench colleagues have done an excellent job of prosecuting their argument over the last day or so. And I don't think there's any value in me rehashing all of the arguments they have made. But looking at the arguments that have been made thematically, there is no doubt whatsoever that these reforms have one principal purpose, and that is to safeguard and entrench the place of the political parties in our electoral system and to prevent emerging talent and new independents from joining the crossbench, which already numbers 18. I'm reminded of a comment from the Prime Minister in one of his very first meetings with the crossbench after the 2022 election. And I hope he forgives me if I misquote him a little, but he said words to the effect of, "You're all great, but we don't want any more of you." And I think my colleagues would remember that statement. At the time, we all had a bit of a chuckle. We thought, that's all very funny. You know what? He wasn't trying to be funny. He was making a very serious comment, which is reflected perfectly in this bill. That we're all lovely, but you don't want any more of us. You don't want any more of us, despite the fact that millions of Australians now have abandoned the major political parties for a range of very good reasons, and they are now searching for an alternative. And this parliament has no right whatsoever to work so hard at denying millions of more Australians from exercising their democratic right to have a ballot paper with a list of good candidates reflecting a range of views, parties, major parties, minor parties, micro parties, independents who might be incumbents or might be putting their name on the ballot paper for the first time. Frankly, I think the government, in cahoots with the opposition who have cut this grubby deal out the back somewhere, they are treating the electorate with complete and utter contempt. For there to be in this bill pages, literally pages of exemptions from what is covered by this bill is scandalous. For this bill to allow, say, the Liberal Party to accept however much money they choose from, say, the McCormack Foundation, or through various underhanded means for the Labor Party to accept enormous sums of money from the union movement, but then to place such limitations, not on us, we're doing fine, with the possible exception of the member for North Sydney, who has a minor difficulty with her electorate. The rest of us said, you know, we're competitive. I think we are genuinely competitive. But what about all those brilliant people out there who are even better than us? They deserve a fair go, and the community deserves or has a right for those people to have a fair go. You know, it is just patently misleading for the government to suggest that they will spend the same amount of money in all 150 electorates next time. They won't. Now, Deputy Speaker, I'll close by saying I'm the first to say, let's have almost real-time disclosure. Let's have spending caps. Let's have donation caps. But let's not concoct such a ruthlessly destructive set of reforms that treats the community with such complete and utter contempt. We have no right to do that in this place. The government has no right to do it. The opposition has no right to do it. And the reason so many people are voting for people like us now is because we're about the only people in this place who will stand up for the community.
I thank the member for Clark. I do deem that the proposed amendment is an ironical one, and on that basis will be ruled out of order. The question is that the bill be agreed to. Sorry. Yes, we have dealt with that amendment. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Just to respond to a range of the matters that have been raised both here in the Federation Chamber and in the House over the course of today's debate, I committed to a range of members that I'd come back to them, arrange to ensure accuracy on a range of assertions, but also to make sure that there's clear understanding of the government's intent around getting big money out of politics. First, to respond to some matters, the member for Indi, which I did before, but again to say the government acknowledges her genuine questions around a review period and potential amendment to the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters review currently included in the bill. I note the Minister has taken that view and agreed to continue consulting with the member on the review mechanisms in the lead up to the Senate debate, and again I wanted to put that on the record. Further to the member for North Sydney, thank you for the genuine questions around administrative spending and the level of the caps. The legislation does make it clear on the definition of administrative expenditure. The bill does not seek to make special exemptions. It does not seek to curtail political organisation or engagement. It seeks to make clear what is campaign spending, money used in the system to influence an outcome and to restrict the use of that expenditure. Parties do have national caps, but are restricted both by the total number and the divisional and Senate limits, calculated to ensure that the $800,000 limit for an independent member is sufficient should various parties also be contesting the seat. I also want to note that it was indeed the government, when it comes to the ability of the member for Curtin to join the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters, it was the government who put that forward. When it comes to the member for Warringah, who asked why would we spend money on strengthening our system, it is the government's view and the minister's view that defence of our electoral system is worth investment. It is worth investing in. Other proposals which the member for Warringah has put forward, like truth in advertising, also cost millions of dollars. and will cost millions more over time. In fact, the member's own proposal when it comes to truth in advertising would itself cost upwards of $50 million. It doesn't mean that it's not a worthy policy consideration and it's not worth debating. The member for Wentworth raised the issue of nominated entities, and I do want to clarify this because I think it's important that we're very clear about how this legislation operates when it comes to nominated entities. As the member herself already knows and has been provided in writing, a nominated entity must be registered with the AEC and must be auditable by the AEC. An entity may only be nominated by one party and only one party can nominate that entity. For all purposes, they are captured and aggregated with their nominating party. And I want to say that again. For all purposes, they are captured and aggregated with their nominating party, which means any donations to that entity or spending by that entity is captured, auditable and listed against the party. There is no ability to get around the caps by the use of that entity. An entity can share resources with their nominating party, but they share each and every spending cap, therefore restricting any perceived benefit. The amendments circulated by the member for Curtin would remove that restriction and allow those entities to spend unrestricted. And again, that's another reason the government does not support them. In terms of some of the matters the member for Curtin raised, the government rejects the assertions and has made clear the amendments suggested that remove campaign limits. It's not a clarification or a question from the member, it's a policy difference. There is a policy difference here. We believe that spending should be limited. The member for Curtin believes it should be unrestricted. They are two very different policy positions, and the government is very clear in our belief that spending should be restricted. It is essential to make sure that we put the power back in the hands of the Australian people. It is unsustainable to argue otherwise. If we accepted the member for Curtin's proposition, then those who are already wealthy would be unrestricted in their spending, again, giving us an uneven playing field. The member for Curtin hypothecated about $5,000 donors giving $200 or $2,000 each, but that's not what's occurring. In her campaign at the last election, it was 10 individual donations ranging from $50,000 to $100,000 from one billionaire donor. For these reasons, the government supports the bill in its existing form. For these reasons, the government does not accept the range of amendments that have been put forward today, and for these reasons, I commend the bill to the House.
Thank the Minister. There being no further speakers on this bill, as it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to this bill in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration. I call the clerk.
Government Business Order of the Day number 2, Sydney Airport Demand Management Amendment Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading and on the amendment moved by the member for Ryan.
Call the Minister in continuation.
Speaker, 38 million passengers passed through Sydney Airport in 2023. The airport is an economic powerhouse, supporting many businesses in my local community and providing 30,000 jobs for people in the Sydney area. With an airport in my electorate, it's something that can be an advantage, but it can also be a disadvantage. And the advantages, of course, are the jobs. The airport provides so many jobs for locals in my community. So many of my mates that I went to school with have jobs related to the airport. My father worked for Qantas for 35 years. My brother and sister both worked in the travel industry associated with the airport. It provides so much employment for locals in our community, and as a result we have relatively low unemployment, and that's a great advantage for our community. There's the convenience of having the airport 10 minutes away when you need to travel. It's quite convenient to be able to jump in a taxi or something an hour before your flight and still make it when you live up the road. But then there are the disadvantages, and one of those is, of course, aircraft noise, which can have an effect on the welfare and the lives of residents. And, Speaker, there is no airport in Australia that has residents living as close to an airport as Sydney Airport in Mascot. In fact, I would hazard a guess and say that there are no airports in the world that have allowed residential development to butt up so close to a major international airport. When I lived in William Street in Botany, if 747s were taking off in the morning on the east-west runway, the house would shake. And there was well and truly about 800 metres worth of homes between myself and the airport that were worse affected than we were. So getting the balance right and ensuring that residents have periods of peace and quiet in their homes while still allowing the effective and efficient operation of Australia's busiest airport is a challenge for governments. And that is why the curfew arrangements and the cap on movements have been put in place through legislation to manage the operation of Sydney Airport. And I'm very proud to say that this government will keep those arrangements in place with these amendments. Now, this government has acted, I'm going to pay tribute to the Minister in a moment, to balance the rights of residents associated with the effective operation of the airport, but ensuring that residents can get some peace and quiet. During COVID, the Morrison government granted exemptions to freight operators regarding the types of aircraft and the number of flights that could be flown during curfew hours, in other words, during the evening when residents are sleeping. This was justified under the Act because there's an exemption that allows in exceptional circumstances that to occur. The exceptional circumstances were that there were large increases in freight volumes coming into Sydney Airport associated with everyone being at home and ordering things online. So the freight levels did increase. But post-COVID, the freight operators sought to continue those exemptions. They argued that the exceptional circumstances continued to exist because freight volumes remained high. Now, rather helpfully, Speaker, we were able to shoot that argument down because the Department of Infrastructure very graciously published their freight data in and out of Sydney Airport on a monthly basis. And that data demonstrated that the volumes of freight that were coming into and out of Sydney Airport had clearly fallen post-COVID, and they'd fallen back to the normal levels of pre-COVID. And that justified the exemptions going back to the original conditions and the curfew being put back in place. And to her credit, the Minister for Infrastructure and the Minister for Aviation acted. She saw that there was a need there, and she made sure that those exemptions that were granted were removed and normal curfew conditions were restored. So, Minister, on behalf of the community I represent, I thank you for listening and for acting to ensure that that balance between effective and efficient operation of the airport and the rights of residents was restored. The Minister also went further in seeing that the Sydney Airport Corporation, Sydney Airport Community Forum, when I raised it, had representatives from the north, representatives from the inner west and representatives from the Sutherland area, but no community representatives from the east in the area that I represent, despite the fact that the airport is actually in my electorate. So I requested that there be a representative from the east and a representative from Randwick Council, which also wasn't represented on the Sydney Airport Community Forum. And again, credit to the Minister because the Minister acted, and there were 2 new appointments made to the forum, with a representative from the east being Alan Dukes, who's very experienced as a former air traffic controller, and the Randwick Mayor appointed to that body. So the government has acted to ensure that we restored that balance, effective and efficient operation of the airport, maintaining competition and the rights of residents in the community that I represent. Now, this all occurred whilst the Minister was dealing with the largest and most comprehensive reforms to the aviation sector in our nation in over a decade through the White Paper. And this bill responds to those recommendations in the White Paper. And the government is boosting consumer rights, increasing competition, protecting passengers with disability, supporting regional aviation and helping the sector to decarbonise. This bill will deliver many of the policies outlined in the Aviation White Paper, but most importantly, it will keep the airlines honest, putting downward pressure on airfares and ensuring passengers get a better deal. And that will be achieved through a new independent ombudsman, helping passengers get better outcomes when things go wrong, a charter of rights for customers, ensuring fair and appropriate treatment for customers, aviation-specific accessibility standards to assist people with disabilities, new requirements and monitoring of airlines to crack down on anti-competitive behaviour and keep the airlines honest, an independent aircraft noise ombudsman, something that will please my community, with the power to conduct independent investigations into the handling of aircraft noise complaints and make recommendations direct to government, and importantly, enhancing regional connectivity, growing a stronger and more diverse workforce and reducing emissions in the aviation sector. All of these are pretty important reforms to the operation of Sydney Airport and aviation throughout Australia. But I do want to mention an important part of this reform, which is colloquially known as the slot management system at Sydney Airport. To encourage competition, the government will update the demand management system so that it better aligns with international standards. The government will significantly increase transparency around how slots are allocated to airlines. Airlines will be required to provide regular information on how they use the slots, such as the reasons for cancellations or major delays, and this monitoring information will be regularly published. To ensure that the slots are not misused, the government will modernise the compliance regime to include penalties that address anti-competitive behaviours, along with updated and strengthened enforcement tools for government to watch airlines more closely and to take effective legal action where necessary. So the government is modernising that process of allocating aircraft slots at Sydney Airport to improve competition and to ensure that consumers get a better deal. There's also changes to regional connectivity, with regional New South Wales services being able to apply to use any slot during a new peak period hours, not just the slots that are already set aside for priority access by regional New South Wales services. So better competition, more access for the regions. The final thing I'd like to speak about, Speaker, is the recovery period. This bill introduces reforms that will increase the resilience of Sydney Airport by introducing a recovery period. Now, this will be a strictly controlled recovery period, and I want to thank the Minister for understanding the importance of the curfew and the hourly cap in legislating this recovery period, because it will ensure that after a severe weather event, and I was there on Sunday night and experienced one where we had 3 to 4 hour delays and other major disruptions, there'll be a temporary allowance for up to 85 movements per hour for a maximum of 2 hours on the same day following the disruption. It's important to note that there will be no increase in the overall number of flights for that whole day. That's because the scheduling cap of 80 flights per hour will stay in place. Only flights that are already scheduled to happen on that day will be able to take off or land, and the recovery period will not extend into curfew hours, and there will be mandatory publication of information about when and why the recovery period is used so that the community can be confident it is being used properly. So this is the government making sure that we are doing our best to improve the efficiency, the effectiveness of the operation of Sydney Airport, to improve competitiveness, to improve rights for consumers, and to ensure that consumers get a better deal from the airport. But most importantly, the Minister has also listened and balanced those issues with the rights of residents in the local community that I represent to ensure that they continue to get access to those important hours, particularly at night, of peace and quiet at home with their family. I commend the bill to the House.
The original question was that this bill now be read a second time. To this, the Honourable Member for Ryan has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The immediate question is that the amendment be agreed to. I call the Minister.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and can I thank members for their contribution to this debate on the Sydney Airport Demand Management Bill. At the outset, I want to acknowledge that this is a really complex area, and that airspace, airports, the operation of airports are really complex, and frankly there are a lot of experts in this field who have lots of opinions and lots of views, and trying to get the balance right is always challenging. But that being said, I acknowledge the second reading amendment that has been moved, but the government won't be supporting that. You will not be surprised to hear. This bill really is a central part of the broader reforms to Sydney Airport demand management, and that really is the subject and focus of this bill. and it is another step of the government's reforms to improve aviation in this country. Reforms that will crack down on poor behaviour by the airlines and get a better deal for consumers. Sydney Airport is Australia's most significant international gateway and a critical hub of the national aviation network. The efficiency and the effectiveness of operations at the airport does have a significant impact on many Australians. So it is right that the reforms proposed in this bill ensure the airport is used to deliver better efficiency, enhanced competition and better consumer outcomes. The bill does this by adjusting the settings of the demand management framework to access to the airport can be managed more efficiently and effectively while maintaining aviation access for regional New South Wales communities and upholding existing community protections from the impacts of aircraft noise. Firstly, the bill gives the Minister for responsibility for developing and making the slot management scheme. This will enable the government to implement improved transparency and governance arrangements for the slot manager and to provide direction on the administration of the slot management scheme. The government's reforms to improve regional access and improve access to slots for new entrants airlines will be implemented through a new slot management scheme. Secondly, of course, the bill introduces new civil penalty provisions to strengthen the compliance regime, which will allow anti-competitive behaviour by airlines to be addressed. The Compliance Committee is also being reformed, with a new membership that will allow the committee to effectively provide independent advice on compliance action. Thirdly, the bill introduces new transparency powers to support the new, stronger compliance regime, and this includes requirements for the production of information and documents, the keeping of records and the publication of information. This will help make sure that consumers have better information about airline performance. Finally, the bill introduces a recovery period to temporarily increase the number of movements at Sydney Airport to 85 for up to 2 hours when a major disruption occurs. The recovery period declaration will only allow flights that were already scheduled to operate on that day to take off or land and will not extend into curfew hours. This will be a mandatory reporting of information on when and why the recovery period is used so that the community can be confident it is being used properly. The bill will deliver a new demand management framework for Sydney Airport that does enable efficient and effective operation of the airport while ensuring communities on the ground are not unduly impacted, and I commend the bill to the House.
The original question was that this bill now be read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Ryan has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The immediate question is that the amendment be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. No. I think the noes have it. Is a division required? As it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to the bill, in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration. I call the clerk.
Government Business Order of the Day number 3, Treasury Laws Amendment Mergers and Acquisitions Reform Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading and on the amendment moved by Mr Taylor.
Me?
The original question was that this bill now be read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Hume has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The question is that the amendment be agreed to. I call the member for Hawke.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This bill is a landmark piece of legislation that will modernise Australia's merger framework for the first time in nearly 5 decades. This reform is about striking a critical balance, equipping our competition regulator with the authority it needs to safeguard markets and protect consumers, while also enabling it to operate with speed and clarity, providing certainty for businesses and our economy at large. Mergers and acquisitions are absolutely essential to a thriving economy. They bring investment, allow businesses to scale and promote innovation. Successful mergers can drive greater efficiencies, expand consumer choices and, importantly, lower costs. However, not all mergers are beneficial for consumers or our economy. Some entrench market power, reduce competition, and ultimately harm consumers. For instance, in the supermarket sector, acquisitions by dominant chains have reduced competition in local markets, leaving consumers with fewer options and higher prices, particularly in regional areas. Similarly, in telecommunications, mergers between major providers have raised concerns about reduced market competition, leading to higher costs and slower innovation in essential services such as mobile and internet access. These examples highlight how unchecked consolidation can harm Australians in their everyday lives and underscore the need for reform. Such harmful mergers show why a robust and responsive competition regime is absolutely essential. It must ensure that harmful mergers are identified and prevented, fostering a competitive environment that delivers fair prices, greater choice and innovation for Australians. Yet, Australia's current system falls short of what a modern economy needs. We are one of only 3 OECD nations without a mandatory notification system for mergers, leaving our competition regulator, the ACCC, to rely on a voluntary and highly reactive process. This creates significant blind spots, where mergers with potential risks to competition can proceed without adequate scrutiny. Meanwhile, pro-competitive and non-contentious mergers often face delays and uncertainty, burdening businesses unnecessarily. Deputy Speaker, the Albanese government's reforms will bring Australia's merger framework into the 21st century. These changes will establish a mandatory notification system, providing the ACCC with full visibility of significant transactions. This ensures that the regulator can focus on the mergers that pose the greatest risks to competition, while businesses pursuing beneficial transactions are supported with a streamlined and efficient process. The reforms will strengthen the ACCC's ability to act decisively. Pro-competitive mergers will advance quickly, with a clear pathway for approvals within 30 working days where there are no concerns for consumers. Harmful or risky transactions, on the other hand, will be scrutinised and, if necessary, prevented. This balance, ensuring markets are both dynamic and protected, is critical to the health of our economy. The bill also introduces monetary thresholds to focus resources where they are most needed. By targeting mergers with the potential to substantially lessen competition, the ACCC can direct its efforts toward transactions with significant economic impact. Transparency and accountability will also be enhanced through the creation of a public register of notified mergers, giving businesses, consumers and stakeholders a clearer view of the process. These reforms are integral to our broader economic vision. An economy built on strong competition, higher productivity and good wages for working people. Competition is the lifeblood of a dynamic economy. It compels businesses to innovate, improve efficiency and deliver better value to consumers. But its benefits extend far beyond markets. When businesses innovate and productivity rises, workers are better positioned to share in these gains through secure jobs, higher wages and improved working conditions. By fostering competition, we reduce the power of monopolies and oligopolies that distort markets and concentrate wealth in fewer hands. Fairer markets lead to fairer outcomes, lower prices for essential goods and services, greater access to opportunities for workers, and more choices for consumers. Importantly, fair competition encourages businesses to invest in their people, recognising that skilled and well-supported workers are critical to long-term success. The Albanese government's approach reflects our belief that strong competition, higher productivity and good wages for working people are not just desirable, they are essential for a fairer, stronger and more resilient economy. Through these reforms, we ensure that Australia's economic growth lifts everyone, building a future that rewards effort, encourages innovation and supports working Australians and their families. Deputy Speaker, these outcomes are only possible with a regulator equipped to act decisively and efficiently. That is why these reforms provide the ACCC with both the authority and the framework to protect competition effectively. Pro-competitive mergers will be able to move forward without unnecessary delays, while harmful or risky transactions will face rigorous scrutiny and intervention if required. This approach not only fosters market dynamism, but also safeguards consumer interests. These are key foundations for our strong and fair economy. This reform reflects our commitment to ensuring a competition regulator that is both effective and efficient, protecting the interests of Australians while providing businesses with greater certainty. It demonstrates the Albanese Labor government's dedication to creating a stronger, fairer and more competitive economy that benefits all Australians now and into the future.
The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Hume has moved an amendment that all words after that be admitted with the view to substitute other words. The immediate question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for North Sydney.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's no doubt Australia is in a period of significant economic transition. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted many critical industries, both globally and domestically, and it will be some time before our economy fully recovers. Coming out the other side of the pandemic, we've entered an inflationary environment which is putting immense pressure on consumers, businesses and governments. At the same time, we are embarking on a much-needed transition to a net-zero economy. In this context, then, competition is more important than ever before. This transition will impact Australia's critical industries, consumers and small businesses in profound ways. New markets are on the horizon, and it is impossible to anticipate exactly how they will emerge or develop. And competition can be a driving force for investment, dynamism and innovation. All are required to undertake this transition, and it is therefore critical we protect it by getting our competition policy reform right from the start. While most merger transactions do not harm competition, and indeed they provide many benefits, some can and do affect the competitive conditions of an industry. And the growing trend of market concentration here in Australia since the early 2000s is not one that we should continue to ignore. According to a 2023 report from E61 Institute, in 7% of Australian industries, the top 4 firms had more than 80% of the market share. I just want to repeat that. In 7% of Australian industries, the top 4 firms had more than 80% market share. Now compare this to countries like the United States, where only 1% of the industries have a market concentration that high. Ultimately, however, my community, indeed most of Australians, don't need statistics to understand the problem. Whether it's electricity, health insurance, retail, the Australian economy is rife with examples of markets where a few big players dominate, and as a consequence, consumers are arguably missing out, while producers and suppliers are squeezed ruthlessly. We see this perhaps most acutely in the tech and supermarket sectors. In tech, a handful of companies are playing an increasingly significant role in our lives, influencing how we interact with each other and do business. And in a striking real-world experience, when I recently tried to plug my iPhone into the car jack of a Volvo that my friend owns, I received a message from my phone saying, "This accessory is not supported by the device." The Volvo was the accessory the iPhone wouldn't accommodate. And I was struck by Apple's market concentration and their ability to corner the market. Meanwhile, in the supermarket sector, Woolworths and Coles alone control about 2/3 of the market. And again, I've witnessed the implications of this personally, with many orchards in my hometown of Coonabarabran forced to be bulldozed or bulldoze their trees after the long-term local independent grocer was acquired by one of the 2 large supermarket chains. Part of the problem is the ability of large businesses to hollow out markets through targeted acquisitions. As multiple former ACCC chairs have acknowledged, Australia's current merger regime is not well placed to deal with this problem. Under the ACCC's current framework, companies aren't required to notify the ACCC of mergers, leaving the Commission most often flying blind. Additionally, the ACCC only reviews a fraction of the mergers that happen each year, on average, an average of 330 annually of the more than 1,000 mergers that occur. This gap leads to the situations like Petstock, which grew through a series of small acquisitions into the second largest specialty pet supply retail chain in Australia, unbeknownst to the ACCC. No wonder the ACCC Chair Rod Sims has described Australia's merger regime as the weakest of any country we compare ourselves to. These trends have consequences for us all. Recent decades have seen businesses increase the markups to goods and services by more than 2%. As Choice and the Consumers Federation of Australia put it, consumers pay the price of highly concentrated markets, including through higher prices, poorer customer service, and lower product and service quality. In this context, I largely welcome this bill and commend the government for taking steps towards a regime that more effectively targets anti-competitive mergers while fast-tracking mergers that are pro-competitive. It is a step towards a future-focused economy that is diverse, efficient and welcoming of new market entrants. There are, however, ways I believe this legislation and competition policy reform more broadly could be improved. Firstly, we must ensure the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission are adequately staffed and resourced to effectively manage the significant increase in assessments that will result from the changes outlined in this bill. Secondly, we must strengthen the ACCC's ability to block problematic mergers. Thirdly, we must ensure thresholds for notification capture all anti-competitive acquisitions. And finally, to truly improve competition and innovation in Australia, we must not only prevent anti-competitive mergers, but actively support small and emerging businesses. To the specifics of the bill before us then, this bill will empower the ACCC as the decision maker on all mergers. Under this new system, the Commission would undertake an economic and legal assessment to determine whether acquisitions are likely to substantially reduce competition or be of public benefit. This would be tied to a mandatory notification system where acquisitions that meet a certain threshold would need to be referred to the ACCC for assessment prior to completion. These key thresholds are: 1. When the Australian turnover of the combined businesses exceeds $200 million and the assets being acquired have either an Australian turnover of more than $50 million or a global transaction value above $250 million. 2. When a business with Australian turnover of more than $500 million is buying a smaller business with turnover above $10 million. And finally, 3, all mergers by businesses with a combined Australian turnover of more than $200 million, where total similar acquisitions over a 3-year period have a cumulative turnover of at least $50 million. Importantly, the bill allows for the Treasurer to adjust these thresholds in response to concerns from the ACCC about high-risk mergers. The Commission's approval system would also be reformed, with the goal of completing approvals in under 30 days for mergers that are determined not to pose a threat to competition. And these changes would also provide for the Competition Tribunal to review the ACCC's decisions. And finally, the bill would establish a public register of all mergers and acquisitions, providing all of us clear line of sight on how our markets and suppliers are developing. As a result of these reforms, there's a lot to like about this legislation. It improves oversight for both large acquisitions and the accumulation of smaller, creeping acquisitions. It makes an effort to balance this new oversight with efficiency under a faster approval process for unproblematic mergers, and it allows for the thresholds to be flexible over time. And I've noted the ACCC currently only assesses a small proportion of mergers, however, and this reform will be a significant change for the Commission as it deals with the potential for more assessments and a commitment to faster approvals. The government has argued the increased resourcing given to the ACCC will be commensurate with the increased workload, and the January 2026 commencement date will give the Commission time to prepare for the transition. And this may be true, but it isn't guaranteed. We're talking about the biggest merger reform in nearly half a century, and the transition will have to be managed properly to prevent a blowout in costs and delays for government and business alike. Historically, the ACCC has been unable to prevent many large mergers. In fact, just last year, the Commission blocked the ANZ Bank from a $4.9 billion takeover of Suncorp's banking arm, only to have their decision overturned by the Competition Tribunal. The same thing occurred in 2017 with the merger of Tabcorp and the Tats Group. This is not to say that the oversight of the Competition Tribunal is a bad thing, but it does suggest the two organisations are not always aligned on principle. And it's unclear what that means for the ACCC's ability to effectively block what it may deem is an anti-competitive acquisition. More importantly, the thresholds in this bill may not capture several kinds of concerning mergers and acquisitions. Under this framework, for example, businesses with a combined Australian turnover less than $200 million will not need to report unless the business or assets being acquired have a cumulative Australian turnover of over $50 million over a 3-year period, or a global transaction value of about $250 million. Now, that is already quite a high bar. But the real problem here is that these thresholds don't consider the size of the market a business is operating in. For large, high-turnover markets like medical, insurance or electricity retail, these thresholds may be reasonable. But if the market is smaller, numbers like 200 million may represent a much higher percentage of total market activity, and businesses with significant market share may fly under the radar. We know that the government was considering a market concentration threshold during consultation, so I've got to confess I'm disappointed to see that it's absent from this bill. Overall market share is a much better indicator of the problem we're trying to prevent than simple monetary turnover. Similarly, the thresholds don't consider regional market concentrations, and again, I speak from personal experience. Growing up in regional Australia, I'm aware of the limited choices that consumers sometimes face. There might only be one bank, one grocery store and one petrol station in the whole town. Under this legislation, mergers could potentially be used to corner a market in an entire regional area while staying under the notification threshold. The threshold also wouldn't stop large companies from gaining an early advantage in markets by acquiring early-stage companies who don't yet have a high turnover. The obvious example is Instagram. When Facebook bought Instagram, the company had no revenue. If this purchase happened in the Australian context, this bill wouldn't have required that to be referred to the ACCC. Clearly, parts of this legislation could be strengthened. Instead of it simply allowing the Treasurer to adjust these thresholds over time, we should aim to get them right from the beginning. We need merger reform that tackles market share, early acquisitions and geographic considerations. Finally, I'd like to speak about the role of small business in the context of these reforms. To truly embrace competition, we must do more than simply regulate big mergers. We need to actively support new and established small businesses. According to the Bureau of Statistics, 2023-24 saw a 1.4% decrease in the number of Australian businesses with 1 to 4 employees, while businesses with 5 to 19 employees remain relatively stagnant, with only a 0.4% increase. This is reflected in the GDP figures. In 2006, small businesses contributed 40% of our GDP. Now that number is 33%. Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman Bruce Bilson described Australia as, and I quote, sleepwalking into a big corporate economy. To increase competition and drive an efficient, diverse economy, we must consider measures to support these small businesses, especially in their early stages. There are many ways we could do this, from expanding the digital learning and practical support tools available online to increasing tax offsets for new small businesses. Of particular relevance to competition reform, however, is the need to implement a ban on unfair business and trading practices which harm small businesses and discourage investment. When there is a power imbalance, big businesses in Australia can impose harsh commercial arrangements or behaviours on smaller ones. Singapore, the United Kingdom and the European Union all have laws to explicitly ban this kind of unfair practice, and Australia should follow suit. In short, we should be using all the tools at our disposal to build a competitive economy with a thriving small business sector. I commend the government for bringing this bill before the House to improve Australia's management of large mergers and acquisitions. But I also encourage the government to make sure that the ACCC is not only resourced to handle this transition properly, that the thresholds truly prevent mergers from slipping through the cracks, and that ultimately we support new small businesses to create a truly future-focused economy for all Australians. Thank you.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Wentworth.
Deputy Speaker, ensuring suitable levels of competition in the Australian economy has been something many Australians have taken for granted for a long time. But currently, in a cost of living crisis, the issue of competition is front of mind for many of my community. Research conducted by E61 last year showed that Australia was far more prone to high levels of market concentration compared to our peers like the United States. And it shows. Currently, we have 2 supermarkets that dominate 70% of the food and grocery market, 2 airlines that represent 98% of the domestic airline market, 4 banks representing 75% of the market, 4 media outlets representing 78% of the market, 3 telcos operating with 89% of the communications market, 3 insurers representing 74% of the general insurers market. And of today, we have 2 political parties hoping to capture 100% of the vote market. In fact, the E61 research shows that around 7% of all Australian industries had more than 80% of the market share, dominated by 4 companies or fewer. Compare this to the US, where only 1% of their industries have that level of concentration. Now, I admit Australia and the US are different countries and have different market dynamics and different scale. I also acknowledge that, in certain circumstances, economies of scale mean that we do get cheaper products to consumers. So there are benefits of bigger companies in certain circumstances. But I think right now there has been never more an urgent opportunity, an urgent need for competition to be a focal point for regulation. I welcome this bill for its intent to modernise merger reforms and introduce an international best practice approach for dealing with competition considerations in Australia. But I and others do have concerns about the unintended consequences this bill will have on small and particularly young firms. While I'm glad to see there are review provisions in this legislation, we will monitor this legislation closely going forward. So the bill would replace the existing merger framework with one including mandatory notification. In practice, this reverses the onus onto the companies to disclose ahead of time so that proper consideration can take place instead of requiring the AUSCCC to initiate proceedings. The law will specify that M&A proposals that meet one of the notification thresholds will require mandatory reporting. These notification thresholds cover mergers that represent a combined turnover of the business that is above 200 million, part of a series of mergers of the same or similar goods and services within a 3-year period, and any merger involving a very large business with a turnover of more than 500 million buying a business where the acquisition exceeds 10 million. These thresholds will increase the number of mergers the ACCC will need to review and will effectively cover many of the mergers or acquisitions of Australia's largest companies. The Senate report notes that stakeholders are broadly on board with the proposed changes and there is broad cross-party support. And while the monitoring of competition impacts of M&A is important, I note that this bill is not without the risk of unintended consequences. These risks particularly affect young firms if the ability to be acquired or merge is impeded or restricted. For young firms, an acquisition provides one of the few opportunities for early-stage investors to exit and realise gains on an investment, often made several years before. If a merger cannot take place, the investor must either wait for another investor to buy them out or for the company to list publicly. Patient capital is hard to find and getting harder, with banks and superannuations effectively holding their nominal investments in small business and venture flat over the past decade. Now, that's not good for anyone. Acquisitions also provide good opportunities and good businesses and good ideas the opportunity to scale quickly. It's not always the case that a reduction in acquisitions is bad, and I note that the Treasurer has agreed to review the thresholds after a period of 12 months, a condition that I warmly welcome. I also note that the sort of impulse of this regulation is of concern for different parts of the economy that I've spoken to, including the property sector and other sectors which are questioning how they will or should be filling into this legislation. Now, look, as I said, I welcome this bill. I think it is appropriate, but I do think we need to get it right. And I do have concerns, in particular, about the ability of the regulator to meet the additional requirements.
Order. Apologies, Speaker. Division has been called for the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the divisions. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. And I call the member for Wentworth in continuation.
Speaker. As I was saying, whilst I welcome a best practice approach, I do have concerns about the ability of the regulator to meet the additional requirements and their ability to undertake their investigations in a diligent and timely way. The legislation requires Phase 1 determinations to be made within 30 days, Phase 2 determinations to be made after 90 days. But as we've seen with other regulatory organisations, these types of benchmarks are easily skirted, often not met, and I hold the same concerns here, including that stop-the-clock rights exist for the ACCC, as we see in other regulators. Additional requests for additional information are anecdotally used by regulators to create more time when they have technicality, when they've got challenges meeting their deadlines. And if this is the case, the legislation has the potential to delay mergers, costing money and resources and placing businesses through additional regulatory hurdles with limited benefit to competition and the community. I encourage the review in 12 months to also consider the responsiveness of the ACCC and to assess that as part of the review, and to ensure that and also to assess whether measures like stop the clock or other types of additional information measures are being used or in ways that are actually delaying the assessment of these applications. Deputy Speaker, I'd also like to acknowledge that this bill has undergone a Senate review that made 4 recommendations in light of these concerns and concerns made by others. In particular, I welcome recommendation 2. In addition to the 12-month review, the Senate report recommended an expert implementation advisory panel to be established, which specifically called out the likes of the Tech Council of Australia that represent many of these young and innovative firms. I think it is absolutely critical that young and innovative firms are represented in this sort of panel of review, because it is critical that this legislation really enables competition, really enables innovation and dynamism, and there is a danger in that there could be some unintended consequences which, under certain circumstances, may actually dampen down that competition, dynamism and creation of new firms. And so I warmly support that recommendation, and I think it would help the business community be reassured that the unintended consequences of the bill will be taken seriously. In conclusion, I support this bill because competition is a major concern. And I note that similar models are working effectively in other jurisdictions and have the ability to ensure that Australia continues to be a country with effective and robust business competition. I support this bill because I really want to support young, innovative and small businesses, and I think it's really important that we continue to let those businesses thrive, and part of that is making sure that they have and are able to compete with larger businesses. However, I identify the risks associated with imposing these different burdens on business, which including stifling exit opportunities and thus investment, and delaying the process of effective mergers through regulatory bottlenecks. I think an implementation review is a sensible recommendation in addition to the 12-month review of thresholds, and encourage the government to seriously consider implementing the recommendations of the Senate report. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. There's no doubt that a huge number of Australians are suffering serious cost of living challenges, and there's significant political pressure to come up with instant solutions to make a real difference to cost of living. Now, while the government can have an impact on inflation, many of the factors affecting inflation and cost of living are beyond the reach of the federal government. Geopolitics, pandemics, supply chain complexities, governments may be blamed for these things, but they can't really do much about them. But one of the things that the government can impact is competition. Now, this is not a quick fix for cost of living, but over the long term, getting the rules right when it comes to how companies can compete in Australia has a significant impact on costs for consumers. Effective competition drives efficiency and productivity. That means better products at lower prices for Australian consumers. Duopolies and oligopolies are bad for consumers. While competition law is complicated, most people understand this intuitively and are suspicious of big companies having too much power. For groceries and living essentials, the Coles-Woolworths duopoly has been accused of driving up prices and passing the buck to shoppers. For travel, the Qantas Virgin duopoly has similarly been accused of forcing out competition and passing on poor service and high costs to travellers. And here in politics, the duopoly of the Labor and Liberal political parties have been accused of using parliamentary power to shut out new political entrants. Now, obviously, the political party duopoly is not considered as part of this Treasury amendment, unfortunately, but it is good to see the government promoting competition in business. Voters might be stuck with less political competition, but this amendment is a good move for consumers. Now, the existing merger law and clearance process has been in need of reform for some time. In 2021, the then ACCC Chair Rod Sims argued for reform, and his successor Gina Cass-Gottlieb, an eminent competition lawyer with extensive experience on both sides of the merger regulation process, also supports the creation of a formal merger clearance process. The current law in the Competition and Consumer Act says that companies can't acquire shares or assets in a company that would substantially lessen competition in any market. The key problem with this law is that there's no requirement for parties to notify the ACCC before completing a merger. Because there's no requirement, the ACCC instead has established an informal merger review process where parties can first ask the ACCC for advice on the competitiveness of the merger before it's completed. This process, which has no formal status in law, lacks transparency and does not provide an informed basis for market participants to understand their legal and regulatory risk. In short, it's not fit for purpose. This bill amends the Competition and Consumer Act to better reflect the requirements of modern markets. This bill introduces mandatory notification when companies involved in mergers meet certain thresholds. Monetary thresholds are the simplest way for companies to know when they need to notify. This regime needs to work for businesses. But the bill also preserves an ability for the Minister to introduce market concentration-based thresholds for compulsory notification in the future. I'm concerned about this. Although these types of thresholds have been used overseas, market concentration-based thresholds for compulsory notification add complexity and are opposed by many competition law experts in the field because they add uncertainty, risk and compliance costs to the first step in the clearance process. For this reason, I'll be proposing an amendment to delete section 51 ABP3C to remove the ability for the Minister to introduce market concentration-based thresholds. It needs to be clear to companies when they need to notify. If after a review of the Act it's found that the existing thresholds are not working, I think this should come back to Parliament for consideration so that further complexity is not added for business without appropriate scrutiny and a weighing of the costs and benefits. The bill also allows the Treasurer to designate high-risk parts of the economy where the ACCC will be able to review all mergers regardless of whether they meet other thresholds. This could be used for airlines, supermarkets or any industry where there are specific competition concerns. While I support this aspect of the bill does not require the Treasurer to seek advice from the ACCC before making such a designation. I think this is a problem. ACCC consultation should be a requirement, not an option. The government informs me that the ACCC is likely to be central to this process, so I see no need to allow the Treasurer to designate an industry as high risk without the advice of the ACCC. I'm concerned that this could be used for political purposes, where a particular industry could be kicked with greater scrutiny in an effort to appease the public, rather than where there are specific and well-founded competition concerns. I'm not reassured by the government saying that the ACCC could always participate in a public consultation process. The ACCC has specific expertise and a specific role in this area and should be consulted specifically in advance of any public consultation process. For this reason, I'll be proposing that section 51 ABQ4 be amended to change may to must to ensure the ACCC has a clear role in the designation of any high-risk parts of the economy. I have one more concern. The merger-specific expanded definition of substantial lessening of competition is a significant change to a concept that's been the subject of decades of judicial application and reasoning. I'm still not clear why a different definition is necessary here, and I'm concerned that it may cause confusion. I'd urge the government to explain this added complexity and use any opportunity to clarify the difference in definitions. These minor changes aside, the bill increases the transparency and scrutiny of private mergers and makes the regulation a mandatory reporting regime so that the ACCC can monitor how our business acquisitions are affecting competition. I recognise that we do need to reduce red tape so that businesses can get on with doing what they do best, particularly given our period of low productivity. And I recognise that this will create a regulatory burden, particularly in the private equity sector. The Coalition has pointed out some other concerns, ACCC resourcing and the compliance burden, and I respect that these do need to be considered. But the benefits of this amendment could deliver for cost of living relief, and that's so important that I'm happy to support the passage of this bill, ideally with my amendments. More competition in supermarkets, in sectors like supermarkets, airlines, fuel and liquor, should result in lower prices and more choice for consumers. We need to be more assertive in formulating law and policy to address the stronghold the duopolies and oligopolies have on Australian markets. A fit-for-purpose merger clearance process will improve the regulation of competition in Australia, in turn encouraging innovation and new entry into important sectors in Australia. The goal here is lower prices for consumers. The government must pull all levers possible to respond to the cost of living crisis, and ensuring better market competition is one lever to pull. I commend this bill to the House.
And I thank the member. The question before the Federation Chamber is that the amendment be agreed to, and I give the call to the Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and Treasury.
I thank those members who have contributed to the debate. This bill delivers a new, faster, stronger, simpler, more targeted and more transparent merger system that will help deliver what we all want: a stronger, more competitive and more productive economy. Our country is facing some of the most significant structural changes in our history, with increasing digitalisation, particularly artificial intelligence, the net zero transformation and the rise of the care economy. We need to ensure that workers aren't unfairly prevented from shifting to a better job, and we must look after the most vulnerable. In Australia, productivity growth has slowed and many aggregate measures of dynamism have declined. A range of competition indicators suggest the overall deterioration in competition in Australia since the early 2000s. We've seen the average market share of the largest 4 firms in each industry increase from 41% in 2001-02 to 43% in 2018-19. And average price markups are estimated to have increased by around 6% over the past 2 decades. A range of concentrated sectors are evident across the economy, ranging from baby food to beer. During consultation, Choice and the Consumer Federation of Australia highlighted adverse consumer outcomes in highly concentrated sectors: groceries, banking, telecommunications, energy, the digital economy. And farming groups raised concern about market concentration in supply chains, with limited options for buying inputs and selling products, impacting their ability to sell at competitive prices. Competition encourages innovation, puts downward pressure on prices, and leads to improved choice and quality of products and services for consumers and businesses. Merger law is a key pillar of competition policy. It plays a critical gatekeeper role in preventing anti-competitive mergers before they take place, protecting consumers and promoting competition. Even small increases in prices resulting from anti-competitive mergers can be harmful for consumers. Analysis by the ACCC and their ex-post review of Caltex's acquisition of Milemaker found that petrol prices in local areas near the Milemaker sites had increased by around 0.8 cents per litre at the pump, or around 0.5%, costing motorists around $6 million every year. The need for merger reform is clear. The current ad hoc merger process is unfit for a modern economy, lagging best practice in comparable countries. Australia is one of only 3 OECD countries that doesn't currently require compulsory notification of mergers. For business, the current system can be too slow and cause expensive delays from some businesses as they wait. We heard from the Business Council of Australia and the Tech Council that the process can also lead to considerable uncertainty and can be unpredictable. The current system relies on judicial enforcement, which can involve delays of multiple years while cases wend their way through the hierarchy of courts at considerable expense to the parties. The current approach is also not transparent for businesses or the community. There was widespread agreement from stakeholders that increased transparency would help merger parties other businesses and consumers to engage with ACCC merger reviews. Improved transparency will also allow the community to understand what mergers are doing to the economy. For the ACCC itself, it's been dealing with inadequate merger notifications, insufficient information and a reactive adversarial approach from some businesses, with limited capacity to present economic evidence in court. The voluntary nature means that merger parties can proceed to complete or threaten to complete the merger before the ACCC has finalised its review. Last year, over 1,400 mergers were recorded at a value of around $300 billion. Meanwhile, the ACCC looks at an average of 330 mergers a year. But we don't know whether these are the right 330 or the mergers with the greatest potential to cause harm. What we do know is that there are anti-competitive mergers that have escaped detection under our current system, only to be found out after the fact. In one example, the ACCC became aware of a large number of acquisitions completed between 2017 and 2022 by Petstock, the second largest specialty pet retail chain in Australia. To address concerns about the impact on national and statewide chain-on-chain competition and competition in local areas, the ACCC accepted a court-enforceable undertaking from Petstock to divest a package of sites and assets, including 41 specialty pet retail stores and 25 co-located veterinary hospitals. In another example, Steadfast, Australia's largest strata insurance broker, broking around 40% and writing around half of Australia's strata policies, has in just over a decade spent more than $1.6 billion on the acquisition of insurance brokers and underwriters. According to the ACCC, Steadfast has amassed this very significant market position with almost no notifications, only one in the last 3 years, which was very shortly before completion. The ACCC has publicly highlighted this as an example of the critical problems with the current informal voluntary approach to merger control in Australia. In a third example, Primary Healthcare didn't notify the ACCC of their acquisition of Healthscope's pathology assets, which removed a significant third player, leaving just 2 major full-service pathology providers in Queensland. After investigation, the ACCC accepted remedies to restore a competitive market structure in Queensland. But addressing the effects of anti-competitive mergers after the harm has already occurred is not a good deal for consumers dealing with cost of living pressures, nor for business. And the time and difficulty in obtaining information post-completion poses challenges in effectively remedying the harm and restoring competition. Concerns have also been raised about potential land banking by supermarkets, which may block competitors from developing sites and entering local markets. This bill responds to those issues, bringing our merger system into the 21st century. These reforms will ensure that future acquisitions that meet the notification thresholds will be subject to scrutiny, empowering the ACCC to effectively and efficiently detect and prevent anti-competitive mergers and acquisitions. The size of the benefits is substantial. Drawing on evidence from overseas, Treasury has estimated that an effective merger regime may be worth between $340 and $732 million a year to the Australian economy, while noting that the status quo settings already achieve some of this. The gains will build over time too, as more and more areas of the economy are saved from facing higher prices from anti-competitive mergers. If the new system stops just one additional merger that would have resulted in a 5% price rise in a market the size of $200 million, it will save consumers $10 million a year. For context, a $200 million market is about the size of the newspaper and book retailing market in Western Australia. Getting our merger and competition settings right will attract investment and allow startups to enter the market, to challenge incumbents, promoting growth and innovation, reversing the concentration of market power in a small number of firms. The benefits from stronger competition are significant. Overall, Treasury and Reserve Bank estimates suggest Australia's GDP could be 1.3 percentage points higher if competition were restored to the same level as the 2000s. In today's dollars, that's $30 to $80 billion a year. This bill introduces a mandatory and suspensory administrative system to better address anti-competitive mergers and acquisitions. It'll simplify and speed up the process for review of mergers and acquisitions for businesses and the ACCC. Give the ACCC stronger powers to identify and scrutinise transactions that pose a risk to competition and improve transparency so we're all better informed. The new merger control system will be mandatory from the 1st of January 2026. Mergers above certain notification thresholds will need to be notified and approved by the ACCC as the first instance expert administrative decision maker. Most mergers have genuine economic benefits and are an important feature of a healthy, open financial system. But some mergers can cause serious economic harm. The new system will be targeted and risk-based. Not every merger will be captured, and more resources will be devoted to addressing mergers posing the greatest risk to the economy. The thresholds will be set according to evidence of expected harm, allowing the ACCC to focus its efforts. The system will be responsive to insights from the latest evidence and economic theory as our economy rapidly changes. Regardless of whether you think mergers are a significant economic problem or not, you should support this bill as best practice regulation. The notification thresholds will be set through legislative instruments to ensure the system is agile, flexible and able to adapt to evolving issues in the economy. The government intends to set monetary thresholds via legislative instruments following the passage of this bill. There'll be 3 key objective risk-based targeted thresholds to capture economically significant acquisitions, acquisitions involving very large businesses and serial acquisitions. We want to see the majority of mergers approved quickly so the ACCC can focus on the minority that give rise to competition concerns. Land acquisitions involving residential property development and certain commercial property acquisitions won't be included to avoid clogging up the system with simple land purchases. The bill also provides flexibility to allow the Treasurer to adjust and calibrate the thresholds to respond to evidence-based concerns from the ACCC about high-risk mergers, such as in the supermarket sector. On the advice of the ACCC Chair, the government also intends to use this power to get the competition regulator to review purchases of an interest above 20% in an unlisted or private company if the monetary notification thresholds are met. This is a significant change for the ACCC, for business and the community that'll shape the boundaries of merger control over time. These reforms will improve community awareness and understanding of merger assessments, deterring anti-competitive mergers before they're proposed. To support the transition to the new system, businesses will be able to voluntarily notify and opt into the new system from the 1st of July 2025. We're also retaining the existing prohibition against anti-competitive mergers for those that are not required to be notified. The ACCC will also be able to waive the requirement to notify to support businesses to transition to the new system with greater certainty. There's important work that needs to be done to prepare for the start of the new system, including ensuring the ACCC has economics and data and analytics toolkits that it needs ready to go. Passage of the bill this year gives business and the ACCC time to prepare, facilitating a smooth transition and enabling the system to quickly mature. To ensure the system is operating as intended in the future, the thresholds will be reviewed 12 months after coming into effect. And there'll be a statutory review 3 years from the start of the new system to evaluate its functioning and effectiveness, driven by data and evidence, designed and supported by the Australian Centre for Evaluation. To promote accountability, the ACCC will report annually on statistics and data underpinning the new scheme. The ACCC is also committed to revitalising and expanding its Performance Consultative Committee to advise on the ACCC's merger review functions, as well as the broad range of the ACCC's responsibilities. Together with the new public register and other safeguards, business and the community can be confident these reforms will achieve greater timing certainty and transparency around decision-making. Together, these changes will meet community expectations that the ACCC can detect and stop harmful anti-competitive acquisitions and give business certainty, predictability, and make it easier for the majority of mergers to be approved quickly. This bill represents the biggest reform to merger settings in half a century. Greater competition is crucial for lifting dynamism, productivity and wages growth, putting downward pressure on prices and delivering more choices for Australians dealing with cost of living pressure. The government's committed to building a more competitive, dynamic and productive economy, and this bill will help to achieve this. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Treasurer Jim Chalmers and the contributions to the Competition Review Expert Advisory Panel, the ACCC, businesses and the broader community on the consultation and development of this bill. A range of stakeholders have expressed support for reform of Australia's approach to merger control, including business, consumer groups, small business, the agricultural sector and competition law experts. I particularly want to thank Tori Barker and Nick Terrell from my office, colleagues from the Treasurer's Office, officials from the Department of the Treasury's Competition Task Force, including Marcus Betsy, Jason McDonald, Annalisa Hager, Natasha McNamara, Jack Elliott, Stella Leung, Jessica Kwong, Lillian Yun, Shenika Chen, Jeffrey Goh, Rocky Mee and Adam Spence, and officials from Treasury's Law Design team, Jessica Robertson, John Robinson, Amy Jarvol, David Haynes, Ron Harry and Kurt Nakan. I commend this bill to the House.
And I thank the Assistant Minister. Now, the original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the honourable member for Hume has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. So the immediate question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I'll put that question. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. No. Is a division required? No, a single voice in the division required? Okay. As it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to this bill, in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration, and I call the clerk.
Government business, order of the day number 4, Oversight Legislation Amendment, Robo-Debt Royal Commission Response and Other Measures Bill 2024, resumption of debate on second reading. And I thank the clerk. The question before the Federation Chamber now is that this bill be now read a second time, and I'll give the call to the member for Moreton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Between 2016 and 2019, over 443,000 Australians received notices of debt from Services Australia. 443,000. The bare facts of this debt collection process, which became known as robo-debt, were the following. Firstly, these notices were false. Secondly, they were generated by a process called income averaging, which failed to produce an accurate debt figure. And finally, the process did not comply with the Social Security Act 1991, or the law. Put simply, this means these Turnbull-Morrison debt notices were unlawful. Those are the facts, Deputy Speaker. However, what these empirical facts fail to illustrate is the damaging impact these notices of debt had on hundreds of thousands of Australians. The personal toll was significant and traumatising. Deputy Speaker, as I'm sure you well know, people died because of these Turnbull-Morrison debt notices. People died. Many people felt ashamed and stigmatised, the opposite of how Australian welfare recipients should be treated. In many cases, victims were made to feel like criminals as they were relentlessly pursued by outsourced debt collectors. And in some tragic circumstances, the receipt of a Turnbull-Morrison debt notice played a role in those subsequent suicides. The very well-respected Royal Commissioner, Catherine Holmes, provided the following summary in her detailed report, and I quote, "Robo-debt was a crude and cruel mechanism, neither fair nor legal, and it made many people feel like criminals. In essence, people were traumatised on the off chance they might owe money. It was a costly failure of public administration in both human and economic terms." End quote. The implementation of the scheme by the coalition governments is a lasting and shameful stain on their political records. But they should not be held accountable just for the total initial implementation, Deputy Speaker. The scheme lasted for 4 long years, and as it progressed, there was both increasing public distress and well-publicised criticism. As the Prime Minister said when the Royal Commission handed down its report, Prime Minister Albanese, for more than 4 years, Liberal ministers dismissed or ignored the significant concerns that were raised over and over again, including in the Parliament, but also by victims, by public servants, particularly some brave public servants, by community organisations and, of course, by legal experts. And I do particularly praise the public servants that had the courage to call out what was a travesty of justice. Some public servants, I won't name them, I'm not one for using parliamentary privilege, but I condemn for their cowardice, The final Royal Commission report was damning, and it stated, the beginning of 2017 was the point at which robo-debt's unfairness, probable illegality and cruelty became apparent. It should then have been abandoned or revised dramatically, and an enormous amount of hardship and misery, as well as the expense the government was so anxious to minimise, would have been averted. Instead, the path taken was to double down, to go on the attack in the media against those who complained, and to maintain the falsehood that, in fact, the system had not changed at all. The government was, the Department of Human Services and Department of Social Services ministers maintained, acting righteously to recoup taxpayers' money from the undeserving, end quote. So despite the growing body of evidence, it took a ruling by the federal court for the former coalition government to finally end the scheme in 2020. What a disgraceful, cruel and contemptuous way to treat the Australian public, especially some of our most vulnerable Australians. The Morrison government eventually refunded the unlawful debt repayments at a cost of over $720 million. The refunds came with some sort of grudging apology. It completely lacked grace and contrition and was forced out of the former Prime Minister in question time in Parliament. A formal apology, I note, was never made. Nor has any member of that coalition government ever personally apologised for the deaths and damage that they are responsible for. Obviously, the Liberal Party, a party of free choices, not a collectivist party, they're able to make free choices, and I'm looking forward to them making that decision in terms of being able to live with themselves, the members of those two parliaments. The establishment of a Royal Commission into the robo-debt scheme was an election commitment of the Albanese Labor government, and I thank the Honourable Bill Shorten for being a driver of that process. It began in August 2022 and held 46 days of hearings with over 100 witnesses. The witnesses included victims as well as the Services Australia staff who had been required to implement the scheme from July 2016 to when it was eventually scrapped in May 2020. The Royal Commission received 1,099 submissions. Reading the submissions is a sobering experience. It's unthinkable that so many ordinary Australian citizens suffered so much. It is also unthinkable that it was perpetrated by government departments, by public servants, by the federal government, institutions that the Australian public should have been able to trust. The Albanese Labor government took swift action when the report was handed down. In November 2023, we confirmed acceptance in principle of all 56 of the Royal Commission recommendations. And today I stand in support of the Oversight Legislation Amendment, Robo-Debt, Royal Commission Response and Other Measures Bill. This is the bill that implements our response to recommendations 21.1 and 21.2 of the Royal Commission's report. It focuses on bolstering the oversight capabilities of the Commonwealth Ombudsman and the Inspector General of Taxation Ombudsman. Australians have the right to believe that the Commonwealth agencies are fulfilling their roles impartially and with integrity. The public deserves to trust that these institutions are operating lawfully and transparently, and that is where the role of the Ombudsman comes into play. The bill will amend the Ombudsman Act from 1976 and the Inspector General of Taxation Act 2003. It boosts the powers of the Ombudsman and strengthens the foundations of their independent and robust oversight role. This addresses the findings of the Royal Commission that the checks and balances that should have stopped robo-debt were ineffective. The Royal Commission found evidence that documentation was withheld from the Ombudsman. This was crucial evidence that called the legality of the scheme into question. The report also details occasions when the Ombudsman was, and I quote, fobbed off with explanations, and described the situation where the Department of Human Services dissuaded the Ombudsman from mentioning the legality issue at all. Ultimately, the report made it clear that the role of the Ombudsman required bolstering. As a consequence, The bill confers a statutory duty on secretaries and agency heads and officers of their department or agency to assist the Commonwealth Ombudsman and the Taxation Ombudsman in the event of an investigation. This is a recommendation of the Royal Commission, and we're extending it by imposing a requirement that these personnel assist the Ombudsman in discharging all their duties. The Ombudsman will also be granted the power to access agency records fully and directly in the event of an investigation, and also makes it a criminal offence to withhold this access and any required assistance. The capability to undertake impartial and transparent investigations will enhance trust in government agencies, as well, obviously, as the offices of the Ombudsman. The bill contains additional amendments to assist in the efficiency of these oversight duties, including the ability to access documents remotely for an investigation. It also extends the duties and power to apply to other roles of the Ombudsman under the Act, such as the Defence Force Ombudsman and the Private Health Insurance Ombudsman. It amends the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security Act 1986 to ensure that the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security can access assistance when making inquiries about the head of an intelligence agency. The amendments in this bill are part of a larger suite of reforms that the Albanese Labor government has committed in response to the Royal Commission report, that damning report. One of these is the amendment of cabinet procedures to ensure that there is full understanding of legal issues concerning new policy proposals. Yes, Deputy Speaker, the idea that the laws we implement should be legal, it's a radical idea, I know, but that's 2024. We're also re-establishing the Administrative Review Council after its short-sighted abolition under the 2015 Liberal government. The Administrative Review Council is an independent policy advisory body which will inquire into administrative law and monitor the performance of the administrative review system, all important oversight functions. Labor is prioritising funding for measures to implement the Royal Commission recommendations, $2.3 million over 4 years for 23-24 and $700,000 per year thereafter to the Commonwealth Ombudsman to boost its oversight over government agencies. $5.4 million over 4 years with $1.7 million ongoing funding thereafter will enable the establishment of the Administrative Review Council. The Office of Legal Services Coordination will receive substantial funding to focus on the identification and management of legal risks, and this will be supported by additional funding for the Office of Constitutional Law to improve how this risk is identified for Cabinet consideration. Crucially, $5.6 million over 4 years with $400,000 ongoing in new funding for the Attorney-General's Department to develop a legal framework for the use of automated decision-making in government services. Labor has also rejuvenated Services Australia's personnel numbers. Under the former coalition government, they'd reduced staff by 3,800. We've restored funding, staff and efficiency, and human oversight is obviously a necessary part of the system that will ensure that robo-debt is never resurrected. Deputy Speaker, the Royal Commission was established to apportion responsibility for the design and implementation of robo-debt to work out just how a succession of former coalition governments could impose an unlawful and damaging scheme on the Australian public, especially some of our most vulnerable people. Its other aim was to ensure that something like robo-debt can never happen again. This bill strengthens the powers of the oversight function in our democracy. I'll finish by quoting the Attorney-General. Oversight keeps government agencies accountable to the people they serve. This is a baseline standard that should be in place, and this bill is an important part of the Albanese government's wholehearted and committed response to the Royal Commission into the robo-debt scheme. And I commend the bill to the House.
And I thank the member for Moreton. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Royal Commission's findings on robo-debt were damning, and rightly so. It was an intentionally unintelligible, unjust and illegal scheme that was shrouded in secrecy and targeted Australia's most vulnerable people. This so-called welfare cop initiative branded 866,000 Australians as non-compliant and deviant, inflicting deep financial and psychological wounds on people's lives. And it did so without accountability, with no clear processes to safeguard against errors or abuses of power. As the Commission described it, robo-debt was a crude and cruel system
a mechanism that sent letters indiscriminately implying wrongdoing where there was none, forcing recipients to prove innocence under threat of debt recovery. The scale of harm, financial distress, mental health impact, and even the tragic loss of life reflects a government failing in its duty of care to the people it served. Women already facing financial instability were issued erroneous debt notices under robo-debt, exacerbating their economic struggles and severely impacting their mental health. Single mothers reliant on support payments were disproportionately affected, with the stress of unjust debt claims undermining their ability to care for their children. For survivors of domestic violence, the situation was even more distressing, as some found themselves pursued for debts accrued during abusive relationships, re-traumatising them and hindering their efforts to rebuild their lives independently. This scandal revealed more than policy failure. It exposed something deeply broken within the heart of government, an erosion of accountability, transparency and integrity, and above all, care. It was a gross breach of public trust, a failure to uphold the duty of care that public administration promises to each and every Australian. We saw a government more invested in recovering debts and achieving financial targets than in safeguarding the dignity and welfare of its citizens. The numbers themselves tell a story. The $1.8 billion debt recovery target ultimately cost taxpayers $1.7 billion. But robo-debt is about more than statistics. It's about people. Behind every debt letter was a person or family left to navigate a complex, opaque, bureaucratic system that couldn't withstand legal scrutiny. The tragedy is not in the dollars wasted, but in the individuals harmed and the trust in public institutions irreparably damaged. People and organisations across a range of positions of authority failed profoundly in their duty to ensure accountability for robo-debt. The Australian Public Service Commission offered weak justifications for inaction, more recently followed up by the National Anti-Corruption Commission, which initially declined to investigate. The real tragedy of robo-debt lies not just in its procedural failings, but in a stark failure of humanity, and the failures in follow-up are part of that. The NAC is now reconsidering its decision not to investigate robo-debt after a scathing report from the independent NAC inspector into the referrals. Delayed accountability only deepens the wound for those who are affected, suggesting that even the highest oversight bodies lack the urgency to protect those most harmed by government failures. Australians expect a government that serves them, not one that scapegoats them for financial or political expediency. The NAC bar is high, with corruption defined as serious and systemic. But to assume it's not there without even investigating after such serious consequences goes against public expectations. And at the end of the day, the NAC is there to serve. In Goldstein, during my last election campaign, the call for integrity in government was resounding. Increasing accountability was central to my decision to run, and it remains central to my work here. So in response to robo-debt, the government has proposed the Oversight Legislation Amendment Bill. The bill is positioned as a corrective measure to prevent further disasters like robo-debt by enhancing accountability and expanding the oversight powers of the Commonwealth Ombudsman and the Inspector General of Taxation. This bill aligns well with Royal Commission's recommendations, strengthened oversight, statutory duties for agency heads and expanded access to information. It clarifies obligations for public servants to fully cooperate with oversight mechanisms, which is an essential step forward in addressing the accountability failures exposed by robo-debt. Locking in these requirements is a valuable move towards reinforcing a transparent, accountable public service, which was lacking in the robo-debt process. Former Public Service Commissioner Professor Andrew Podger, who's written a discussion paper outlining reforms that balance efficiency with integrity, states it plainly, quote, "Getting the rewards and penalties more in line with frank and fearless advice is crucial for effective governance." The issue during robo-debt wasn't that the Ombudsman lacked statutory power, but rather that the departments themselves withheld cooperation and did not act in good faith. Real accountability is not legislated into existence by mandates or fear of non-compliance. It is born from a culture within government agencies that prioritises transparency and is committed to serving the people. The true lesson of robo-debt is that we need a culture of transparency and ethical governance within our public service, one that empowers public servants to raise concerns about harmful policies and encourages fearless advice. Systems should encourage honesty and value the voices of those directly impacted by policies. The Royal Commission's recommendations go beyond oversight. They suggest a transformative approach to policy making, one that places humanity at its core. As Recommendation 10.1 suggests, policy design should centre on the people it serves. This includes using accessible language, fostering engagement, and acting with sensitivity towards vulnerable Australians. When policy disregards the dignity of those it impacts, it risks becoming an instrument of harm. Oversight, while essential, is not a substitute for culture, and robo-debt was not merely a failure of process. It was a failure of humanity. It calls for more than just oversight. It calls for a reform of our public service culture to reflect empathy, ethical decision-making, and a commitment to transparency. We need a cultural shift. As Rick Morton from the Saturday paper observes, thousands of decisions are made every day in government and ministers touch very few of them. Public servants wield enormous power and must be held to the same standards of accountability and transparency as elected officials. They should not be shielded from scrutiny, but must instead serve as models of ethical governance. Trust in government institutions is alarmingly low, with only 30% of Australians expressing confidence and a mere 12% believing that government is run for all the people. If we're to restore this trust, we must tread carefully. The public needs to see a government that serves with transparency, compassion and respect, and that also applies to the public service and the advice that public servants provide. Last year, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Human Rights recommended legislating a Federal Human Rights Act after receiving hundreds of submissions advocating for stronger protections. The proposal has garnered resounding support from human rights organisations, legal experts and advocacy groups, including the Human Rights Law Centre and a coalition of over 100 civil society organisations. The robo-debt scandal, I would argue, highlights the urgent need for a Federal Human Rights Act to embed respect, dignity and accountability in government processes, ensuring that no individual is subjected to systemic injustices like those inflicted under robo-debt. It would provide clear, accessible standards for treating people with dignity, empowering those affected by unjust policies to seek justice. If robo-debt taught us anything, Deputy Speaker, it's that without a structured legal framework prioritising human rights, policies can devolve into mechanisms of harm, eroding trust in our public institutions. Let us not repeat this mistake. In closing, I will support this bill, but I urge the government to go further. Australians need reassurance that all recommendations of the Royal Commission into robo-debt will be enacted. This includes those it endorsed, but did not include in its final report. Because this is not just about legislative enforcement. It's about building that culture that empowers our institutions to act ethically, transparency and with compassion. Robo-debt stands as a chilling example of moral contempt. The path forward is one of careful reform, putting people, not paperwork, at the centre of our public systems. I commend this bill to the House.
I thank the member for Goldstein. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Werriwa.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. On the 18th of August 2022, letters patent were issued to establish the Royal Commission into the robo-debt scheme. Subsequently, on the 7th of July 23, Commissioner Holmes delivered her report to the Governor-General. A total of 1,099 submissions were received by the Royal Commission and, coupled with public hearings, contributed to a subsequent 1,052-page report. That report, Speaker, listed 57 recommendations, of which the bill before us seeks to implement. The preface of the Royal Commission into robo-debt states in part the following. It is remarkable how little interest there seems to have been in ensuring the scheme's legality, how rushed its implementation was, how little thought was given to how it would affect welfare recipients, the lengths to which public servants were prepared to go to oblige ministers on a quest for savings. Truly dismaying was the revelation of dishonesty and collusion to prevent the scheme's lack of legal foundation coming to light. Equally disheartening was the ineffectiveness of what one might consider institutional checks and balances. The Commonwealth Ombudsman's Office, the Office of Legal Services Coordination, and the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal in presenting any hindrance to the scheme's continuance. The robo-debt scheme will surely go down as one of the most shameful chapters of mal and misadministration in the history of the country. At the time of the release of the Commissioner's report, the Minister for the NDIS and Services Australia said these eloquent and heartfelt words. To all those who took their lives because of robo-debt and their families, we pay our respects. The horrible pain inflicted upon you should never have happened. To the activists, advocates, whistleblowers, journalists, members of Labor and the crossbench, and of course the victims themselves who fought tirelessly for accountability and justice, today is because of you. Never again should people receiving government supports be demonised as second-class citizens. We owe it as a parliament and a nation to ensure that victims of the robo-debt are never forgotten, and we also owe it to them to ensure such an evil scheme never happens again. To this end, robust and effective oversight of Commonwealth agencies is essential to ensure that such agencies act with integrity and in a manner that is lawful, fair, transparent and meets the needs of the communities they serve. Having exposed the failures of robo-debt, the Albanese Government is committed to implementing the recommendations from Commissioner Holmes' report. In doing so, the Government is committed to improve public trust that government agencies are acting with accountability and integrity. The bill implements the Government's response to recommendations 21.2 and of the Royal Commissioner's report. It does this by amending the Ombudsman Act 1976 excuse me, and the Inspector General of Taxation Act 2003. In effect, the bill will bolster the powers and capabilities of the Commonwealth Ombudsman and the Inspector General of Taxation and the Taxation Ombudsman. Both the Ombudsman and the Inspector General play crucial roles and important roles in ensuring government agencies act with integrity, fairness and influencing systemic improvement in government administration. Likewise, the Inspector General of Taxation and the Taxation Ombudsman have an extremely important role in providing assurance to the community that taxation laws are being administered with integrity. Specifically, this bill in relation to recommendation 21.1 imposes a statutory duty on secretaries and agency heads and officers of departments or agencies to assist the Ombudsman and the Inspector General of Taxation and Taxation Ombudsman in the performance of their functions. In relation to recommendation 21.2, the bill strengthens the power of the Ombudsman and the Inspector General of Taxation and the Taxation Ombudsman to obtain full, free and direct access to agency records as a part of an investigation by requiring officials be provided with all reasonable facilities and assistance to exercise these powers. Further, it will be a criminal offence to withhold such facilities or assistance. Importantly, by providing full, free and direct access to agency records as part of an investigation, the bill will ensure the Ombudsman and the Inspector General can undertake full, independent and transparent investigations. I commence these remarks by referencing some of the Commissioner Holmes' comments in the preface to the report. Her observation about the disheartening ineffectiveness of institutional checks and balances is a wake-up call and a lightning rod for a call to change. It is a call that this government will not ignore. We owe it to the nation and to the thousands of victims of robo-debt to ensure our institutional checks and balances are so strong, so robust and so effective that another tragedy such as robo-debt will be prevented. That robo-debt was ever allowed to occur in the first instance was a tragedy and a national disgrace. It's also damning of the institutionals and the checks and balances we rely on to prevent such things occurring. I hope the passage of this bill reassures the Australian public that this government is committed to the highest level of administration and world's best practice of openness and accountability.
And I thank the member for Werriwa. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Kooyong.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I'm pleased to speak to this bill today to see implementation of two very important recommendations of the report of the Royal Commission into the robo-debt scheme. In 2022, a Royal Commission was established to inquire into the government scheme now known as robo-debt. Robo-debt used income averaging to pursue alleged welfare debts that in many cases did not exist. $1.7 billion in debts were unlawfully raised against more than 500,000 social security recipients. A number of those individuals subsequently took their lives as a result of the trauma inflicted by this scheme. Federal Court Judge Bernard Murphy has described robo-debt as a shameful chapter which represented a massive failure of public administration and caused a huge waste of public money. The Royal Commission into robo-debt was damning of the ministers and the public servants involved in the scheme. It found that robo-debt was crude and cruel, that it was neither fair nor legal, and that it made many people innocent people, feel like criminals. The report identified governance issues at the heart of the scheme's failures. It found that the institutional checks and balances that should have raised serious concerns about the robo-debt scheme were deliberately blocked by the Morrison government. A subsequent review, instigated by the Public Service Commissioner, found that 12 public servants failed to act with due care and diligence and to uphold the Australian Public Service's values in their actions with respect to the robo-debt scheme. Those breaches included misrepresentations to the Ombudsman. The Royal Commission found that stronger scrutiny might well have prevented the scheme's continuance and determined that the Ombudsman should not have to depend upon government agencies to undertake searches or to provide documents and information in the course of his or her investigations. The Royal Commission made two recommendations for legislative change to the Ombudsman's Act. The first was that a statutory duty be imposed on departmental secretaries and agency heads to ensure that their department or agency uses its best endeavours to assist the Ombudsman in an investigation. The second was that a corresponding duty should be imposed on the part of Commonwealth public servants, that they must provide all reasonable facilities and assistance to the Ombudsman when the Ombudsman exercises its power to access an agency's records. The amendments in this bill deliver on those recommendations. The amendments improve the powers and capability of the Commonwealth Ombudsman and the Inspector General of Taxation and the Taxation Ombudsman to investigate complaints concerning administrative actions of government officials and agencies and taxation administration decisions and systems. The agencies will be required to assist the Ombudsman, whether she or he is making preliminary inquiries, conducting an investigation, or following up on the implementation of recommendations. And the responsibility to assist the Ombudsman is individually borne by all members of the public service. The bill ensures that the Ombudsman has strong powers to obtain full, free and direct access to agency records. The Ombudsman will not need to depend on government agencies to undertake searches and provide documents and information during an investigation. The new and enhanced duties and powers in this bill will apply to all statutory offices of the Ombudsman under this Act. That includes the private health insurance Ombudsman, the Postal Industry Ombudsman and the Overseas Students Ombudsman.
The bill further recognises the importance of the Inspector General of Tax and Taxation Ombudsman in providing assurance to the community that taxation laws are being administered with integrity, and it introduces equivalent amendments for the Inspector General as for the Ombudsman. Deputy Speaker, while most government agencies engage in good faith with the Ombudsman, the findings of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission demonstrated that the Ombudsman should not have to be reliant on that assumption. Impartial, independent and robust transparency measures are vital to restoring public trust in government. As the Public Services Commissioner has said, Robo-Debt offers important lessons for public servants about ethical decision-making, leadership and accountability. After the findings of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission were published, including the referral of 6 individuals to the National Anti-Corruption Commission for investigation, the public rightfully expected that the conduct of key decision-makers responsible for Robo-Debt would be examined by the National Anti-Corruption Commission. The NAC's decision to not even commence an investigation failed to meet public expectations. It risked undermining public trust in a newly established institution of great value and of great significance to the Australian public. In my view, the NAC's position that an investigation would not be of public value was a misunderstanding of the role of the Commission, its role to scrutinise government bodies in the public interest. Whatever the finding, the public has a right to understand the conduct of those who oversaw one of the most egregious examples of egregious abuses of vulnerable individuals in the recent history of the Australian Public Service. A robust, active and vigorous National Anti-Corruption Commission will add further value by creating a culture in government of transparent decision-making, scrupulous record-keeping and public accountability. I acknowledge that the relevant checks and balances do seem to be working and that the next decision was reviewed by the Inspector and will now be independently reassessed. An independent eminent person will now decide whether or not the Commission should in fact investigate the matter. This is an important opportunity for the NAC to do exactly what the public expects and wants it to do, to act decisively, to protect public trust in our government and our public service. The country looks to see that our premier integrity body has the ability and the desire to seek out and root out corruption in our government. I commend this bill to the House and I trust that the amendments herein will improve the capacity of the Ombudsman to do the same.
And I thank the member for Kooyong. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to speak on a matter that stands at the intersection of accountability, justice and the responsibility of government to its citizens. The Oversight Legislation Amendment, Robo-Debt Royal Commission Response on Other Measures Bill 2024. This bill is more than just a legislative response. It's a commitment to ensuring the past mistakes that affected so many Australians are acknowledged and corrected, and that we learn from these errors to prevent such a tragedy happening ever again. Robo-Debt was a shameful episode in the administration of income support in this country. It was a shameful episode in public administration and in the governing of this country. To look now at how this was not only allowed to happen, but encouraged, cheerleaded, pushed through any barriers and concerns, any warnings of legislative barriers, is like watching a train crash in slow motion. But it's a train crash that has so many victims, some we know about, but countless thousands we may never know of. It seems so obvious that what was happening should never have been allowed to happen, and yet deliberate decision after decision was taken to ensure that it did. They say hindsight is 20/20, but the advice was there at the time. The legal advice, the frontline public servants raising concerns, the AAT decisions that repeatedly ruled against it. They knew. And they knew the damage that was being done, and they didn't care. Surely one of the main ethical underpinnings of government is to do right by the people you are serving. And we here in this place and the other place are elected to serve the people of Australia. And the public servants are employed to be servants of the public. But in this case, that was all put aside in favour of money. The illusory surplus that those opposite promised for 9 long years and never achieved. If they couldn't do it through effective budgeting,
They instead tried to steal money from Australians through the concocting of fake debts. They chose a vulnerable section of the community, people on income support. They used language and false narratives to demonise them, dividing the community with the idea that these people had taken benefits they were not entitled to. They concocted fake debts with a mathematically nonsense concept that attempted to match fortnightly income declarations as required under legislation for income support with annual tax return income declarations by falsely apportioning them evenly across the fortnights of the entire declaration period. And then there was the program that was increasingly impossible to understand, let alone refute. Letters with no phone number to respond to and no ability to seek clarification through Service Australia officers. A rundown public service with increasingly long wait times to get through. A presumption of guilt. And a presumption that if you had accepted the debt, if you didn't respond, no checking that you'd even received the letter. And a presumption that if you agreed that you had declared your tax return income correctly, then you had agreed that you owed the debt that they had calculated. And if by some miracle you did manage to get a complaint lodged within the narrow time frame, you then had to provide documentary evidence to support your dispute, pay slips and timesheets from years and years ago, even if they already had that evidence on Service Australia computers, even if your employers had long gone out of business and weren't able or willing to assist you. Robodebt, this terrible scheme, came from a position of an arrogant, uncaring government. A government that lacked care for its most vulnerable citizens, where the idea of possibly clawing back money overrode any concerns for the individuals being targeted, vulnerable individuals, overrode any ethical or moral considerations, even overrode mathematics and logic, overrode the basic rights of people to be able to understand the debt that was being alleged against them, and overrode their right to query a government decision. The Robodebt scheme, as we all know, was a deeply flawed policy that led to widespread suffering. It was designed to automate the detection of overpayments within the social welfare system, but Robodebt mistakenly assumed that individuals were incorrectly reporting their income. The program's automation and reliance on annualised income averaging rather than actual reported income created situations where citizens were wrongfully accused of owing debts. In many cases, in most cases in fact, these debts never existed. In many cases, the debts calculated by this method were much greater than actually existed. The error was identified in the initial testing. However, the error was ignored in the interest of being able to allegedly review or audit many, many more cases than could be done by humans reviewing the cases more accurately. And of course, to generate many, many more debts than actually existed, countless Australians, especially vulnerable and marginalised individuals, were placed under immense financial and emotional stress. Some entered payment plans and paid back thousands of dollars from their meagre income support, going without food, risking homelessness to try to pay down debts that they never owed in the first place. Many struggled with psychological distress, and as we know, tragically, some took their own lives. And for every individual who suffered, there were families and friends, their children, their mothers and fathers who suffered and, in some cases, still in pain. This was a profound failure, not just a failure of policy, but of governance, oversight and ethics. The Royal Commission into Robodebt delivered an unequivocal verdict on this tragic and despicable episode in Australian government history. It did not mince words in describing Robodebt as a catastrophe, one resulting from government negligence and systemic failures. The Commission's findings make it abundantly clear that accountability mechanisms were insufficient. The need for reform and stronger oversight has never been more evident, because Australians should be able to trust their government, trust the people they elect to act in the interests of them, their electorate. But Robodebt showed us very clearly that the previous government could not be trusted on this. And this is precisely where the oversight legislation amendment comes in. The bill is not just a response, it's a reform. It introduces comprehensive changes aimed at reinforcing the accountability and transparency of our institutions, especially in matters affecting the vulnerable.
It seeks to rebuild trust in our system, particularly in how the government interacts with those who rely on social security. Now, if we turn to some of the bill's key provisions, firstly, the bill aims to strengthen the oversight of decisions that could impact citizens' rights and welfare. It mandates that any future automated debt recovery systems in the welfare sector will undergo rigorous scrutiny and independent assessments. Before such systems are implemented, there will be mandatory oversight from independent bodies and human review of high-risk cases. This reform not only protects against a repeat of robo-debt, but also acts as a safeguard for any future policies where automation intersects with human welfare. The bill also establishes new reporting standards for government agencies. These agencies will be required to publicly disclose the methodologies and assumptions used in any automated processes. In the case of robo-debt, income averaging based on annual ATO data was a root cause of incorrect debt assessments. By requiring transparency on methodologies, this bill aims to ensure that such opaque processes do not put individuals at risk of erroneous debt assessments again. Public reporting will create a form of accountability where policymakers and government agencies are required to justify and explain the rationale behind their systems. Moreover, the bill proposes the creation of an ombudsman specifically tasked with the oversight of government debt recovery processes. This ombudsman would be empowered to investigate complaints, review practices and make recommendations for reform. The establishment of the position will provide citizens with an avenue for recourse and support if they feel they have been wrongly targeted or mistreated by debt recovery processes. This ombudsman will act as a watchdog, protecting the rights of Australians and ensuring that government actions are fair and transparent. The bill also includes measures for improved support for vulnerable Australians who interact with government services. It mandates that government agencies assess the social and financial impact on individuals before embarking on debt recovery. And there will be a greater emphasis on support, information access and compassionate handling for those in financially fragile situations. This bill introduces a human-centred approach to debt recovery, a significant departure from the cold, automated model used in robo-debt. Through the introduction of this bill, we acknowledge the mistakes made and the lessons learned. The robo-debt tragedy underscored the risks of unchecked automation, the consequences of inadequate oversight and the human cost of prioritising efficiency over empathy. This bill puts safeguards in place to make sure that the mistakes of robo-debt are not repeated. It is in many ways a legislative response to the fundamental principle that governance is about people, not about numbers on a spreadsheet. Legislation alone cannot heal the wounds or undo the harm experienced by those affected by robo-debt, but it can demonstrate our commitment to change. It is our responsibility to acknowledge that the mistakes made were more than procedural. They were moral failings, reflecting a lack of empathy, accountability and due process. In the wake of the robo-debt scheme, we are compelled to put structures in place that better align with these values. An important aspect of this bill is the emphasis on rebuilding trust. Trust is a currency that's hard-earned and easily lost. The robo-debt scheme's legacy is a crisis of confidence, where many Australians now feel wary of government systems and question whether institutions meant to serve them will instead turn against them. This bill seeks to restore that trust by embedding transparency, accountability and empathy into the core of government operations. The bill is not just about preventing the past from repeating, it's about building a better future. It represents a new approach to governance, one that views automation as a tool, not a substitute for human judgment and compassion. It seeks to balance innovation with responsibility, efficiency and empathy, and policy with principle. As we look forward, we need to keep in mind the real people who were affected by robo-debt, the families who lost loved ones, the individuals who struggled under the weight of false debt, the families and children who did without in order to repay debts that didn't exist, and the communities who lost faith in their government. Let their stories remind us of the importance of getting this right. This bill is more than a legislative response. It's a call to action, an acknowledgement of responsibility, and a commitment to ensuring that the public's trust is not misplaced. Let us honour those affected by robo-debt by committing to a system that is more transparent, accountable and compassionate. This bill shows that we are committed to valuing the dignity of every Australian and to ensuring that our government serves with integrity and fairness. The bill safeguards against the actions of a future rogue government because, as we saw from the previous Liberal National Government, it appears this is necessary. This bill is a promise to the Australian people that this government will work for them, not against them, and that we are committed to ensuring justice, fairness and compassion in all that we do. Thank you.
And I thank the member for Boothby. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the member for Aston.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Robo-debt should never have happened. It was quite simply a heartless plan which went on for far too long. If there had been much stronger scrutiny of this plan, more effective checks and balances, perhaps this could have been prevented. The hurt, pain and devastating loss suffered by many due to robo-debt can never truly be accounted for, but we can take steps to help ensure that it can never happen again. Oversight makes our institutions stronger and our democracy better. And most importantly, oversight ensures that government agencies are accountable to the people they are there to serve. The report on the Robo-Debt Royal Commission made it abundantly clear. Strong and effective oversight mechanisms are fundamental to safeguard the community in their dealings with government. Trust in government depends on this very thing. This bill helps address two recommendations from the Robo-Debt Royal Commission and looks to expand the statutory duty to assist the functioning of the Ombudsman. In directly addressing recommendations 21.1 and 21.2 of the final report, this legislation seeks to improve public trust in government. It recognises the importance of ensuring the Ombudsman has the necessary legislative powers to undertake full, independent and transparent investigations. The bill implements this recommendation in full, but it goes further than this. The bill extends the statutory duty to assist the Ombudsman to all of the Ombudsman functions. This means that agencies will be required to assist regardless of whether the Ombudsman is making preliminary inquiries, conducting an investigation or following up on implementation of its recommendations. This is about good governance, about having the arms of government be accountable, about the ethics that form how policy is implemented. This is also about providing a measure of justice for the 430,000 people who had unlawful debt notices raised against them. Demonising and victimising welfare recipients is not something that anyone should do, let alone a government. The word welfare, as I spoke about in my first speech to Parliament in 2023, is not a dirty word. It's for the welfare of people in society who, for whatever reason, need a helping hand. People who are at their most vulnerable. And the thing they need least at this time is a fake debt letter generated by a robo-scheme demanding thousands of dollars to be repaid. We are only here because public servants like the heroic Colleen Taylor showed incredible courage in speaking up, showing the integrity and empathy that so many of the public servants I have met also strive to show. I was elected in April 2023 and became the new member for Aston, the second Labor MP for this electorate and the first woman MP in its 39 history at the time. The preceding member for Aston, Alan Tudge, Liberal MP and former minister in the coalition government, oversaw the Department of Human Services at the time of robo-debt. This minister helped wage a campaign of hate and division against the most vulnerable people in society. The widely reported way in which this former Minister for Human Services conducted himself and his office is a reflection upon the values that led to schemes like robo-debt. The Royal Commission heard evidence that this former Minister, Alan Tudge, sought information from the private Centrelink files of those people who spoke out about robo-debt in the media so he could shut them down. Then he provided that private Centrelink information to journalists for publication. Who does that to Australian citizens, to the disabled, to pensioners, to single parents, to people trying to find a job? It's unfathomable. The legacy that Alan Tudge left is one that we will all remember for all the wrong reasons, and the pain that has been endured, not just in members of my community, whose stories I've heard, but from all across the country and in evidence to the Royal Commission. It's an enduring legacy that cannot and should not be forgotten. The victims hurt by robo-debt were fleeing domestic violence. They were homeless, they were sick or frail, those most vulnerable in society. These are the people for whom the term social security is supposed to mean something, again, as I spoke about in my first speech to Parliament. The report may have been released, its findings published, but for those whose lives have been forever changed, or indeed those who lost their lives and for their devastated loved ones left behind because of this scheme, the battle goes on, the scars remain. There are still unanswered questions, and for many victims, no answer will ever be enough. This should never have happened. Lives should never have been lost. The swift establishment of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission when the Albanese government came into power speaks to how outraged we, like many Australians, felt about this dark stain on our history. There were clear legislation, there was, but successive ministers directed that this legislation not be followed. We only know about this because of the Royal Commission. We must find a way to move forward, but remember that the lessons here. The reforms recommended by the Royal Commission are a line in the sand. These changes are part of our larger plan for reform. Reform that the Albanese government is delivering, because we know that making these changes now mean that people who rely on the government for assistance can have trust in the ethics and morals of those in government providing that service. By providing additional funding for the Commonwealth Ombudsman to boost its oversight of government agencies and new funding to reinstate the Administrative Review Council to support better decision-making across government, the Albanese government is committed to ensuring that the integrity of government is never compromised again. We can never fully undo that harm, but we can at least promise that those who had to go through it and everyone else, never again. By further investing in better decision-making through implementing these two recommendations from the Royal Commission's report, we improve public trust in how governments implement policy and prove that strong institutions are fundamental to government. We must always aim to meet and exceed the needs and expectations of the community. The only way to do this is through consistently proving ourselves to the public as having integrity, accountability, acting lawfully, being fair and transparent. This bill will bolster the powers and capability of oversight bodies so that we can ensure this, and I can commend this bill to the House.
And I thank the member for Aston. The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I give the call to the Attorney-General.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This bill protects the community against any repeat of the robo-debt scheme by ensuring Commonwealth agencies are subject to stronger and more rigorous oversight. By bolstering the capabilities of the Commonwealth Ombudsman to provide impartial, independent and robust oversight, the bill delivers on two key recommendations of the Robo-Debt Royal Commission. First, the bill will impose a statutory duty on agency heads and their staff to use their best endeavours to assist the Ombudsman in the exercise of the Ombudsman's functions. This will make it clear that the responsibility to assist the Ombudsman rests with every member of the public service. Secondly, the bill will enhance the Ombudsman's investigatory powers by introducing amendments to ensure the Ombudsman has full and free access to agency records, including by remote means. Agencies will be required to provide reasonable facilities and assistance when the Ombudsman exercises these information gathering powers. Equivalent amendments will also be made to support the work of the Inspector General of Taxation and Taxation Ombudsman. The robo-debt scheme that was established by the former Liberal government and the devastating harm that it caused cannot be allowed to be repeated. The public deserve to have confidence that agencies are acting lawfully and with integrity and that they remain accountable for their actions. This bill ensures that government agencies are subject to stronger and more rigorous oversight. In doing so, it demonstrates the Albanese government's commitment to restoring public trust in our institutions and ensuring that people remain at the centre of policy development and government service delivery. I commend the bill to the House.
And I thank the Attorney-General. Now, the question before the Federation Chamber is that this bill be now read a second time, and I'll put that question. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. The Clerk.
Second reading, a bill for an act to amend legislation related to certain oversight bodies and for related purposes.
And I thank the Clerk. If no member wishes to consider the bill in detail, then I'll put the report question immediately. The question is that this bill be reported to the House without amendment. All those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Against say no. I think the ayes have it. And my understanding is we're reluctant to go on to the next item of business.
I'm happy to finish early if you guys
are. Okay, all right, that's good. In which case, I'll give the call to the member for Reid.
I move that the Federation Chamber do now adjourn.
And I thank the member for Reid. Is the motion seconded?
I second the motion.
I thank the member for Sturt. The question before the Federation Chamber now is that the motion be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Of the contrary say no. Then I think the ayes have it. The Federation Chamber stands adjourned until 9:30 a.m. tomorrow morning, Thursday, the 21st of November 2024.